Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Patterson in Ottawa, and I'm the Executive Director of Canada 2020 and one of the co-founders of the Recovery Project.
Hello, everyone from London. My name is Matt Brown. I'm a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, co-founder of Global Progress, and also of the Recovery Project. Welcome from me.
And on behalf of the Recovery Project team and partners, I want to welcome you to the Recovery Summit, a global virtual event about the kind of world we want to build out of this pandemic. Wherever you're tuning in from today, thank you for joining us. Over the next 4 days, we are going to be hearing from policymakers, business and thought leaders, and a new generation that are working on the kind of bold ideas that could form the foundation of an ambitious global recovery effort. Now, I want to acknowledge that for most of us, we are still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Just over 6 months ago, we watched something happening to others rapidly become something happening to us all. We've all been touched by this crisis, and it has left us trying to figure out what it means for our economies, our politics, and our societies. That is why we are hosting this summit now. As policymakers return from breaks and a momentous legislative cycle gets underway, now is a crucial moment for us to not only reflect on what this pandemic has taught us, but also how we translate that learning into bold ideas that hopefully inspire the kind of political will and action needed for us to build back better. That is what the Recovery Project has been doing since its launch in March of this year. And before we begin today's session, I want to thank a few people and organizations that have helped us get to where we are today. First, I want to thank the Recovery Project's founding partners, Matt Brown and the Global Progress Network, Kevin Page, Helena Gaspard, and Sahir Khan at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa, as well as my very dedicated team at Canada 2020, Mira Ahmad, Carolyn Smith, Luke Gilmore, and Mark Mitchner. Next, I want to thank an ambitious and entrepreneurial group of companies and organizations who have helped us make this summit the best version of itself. Groups like MasterCard Canada, IMC, the Business Council of Canada, Google and the team at YouTube, and the Berggruen Institute. Your support has been instrumental in making this a success. I also want to give thanks to the Daedalus Center for Global Public Health at York University for their generosity and leadership in this crisis. As I mentioned, the Recovery Project launched in March of this year, and we've been busy convening conversations that have charted the full course of this pandemic and what it means for our daily lives. You can find all of our work at recoveryproject.org or subscribe to our podcast feed wherever you get your podcasts. Now to this week. We will be broadcasting between 2 and 3 hours a day here on Canada 2020's YouTube channel. We're covering a lot of ground over that time across our 5 core themes: inclusive societies, shared prosperity, sustainability, democracy, and of course, public health. We chose those themes not to stand alone in their own silo, but to emphasize how each represents a crucial piece of the foundation that a global recovery effort could be built upon. To help bring those themes to life, we have had the pleasure of working with 5 distinguished co-chairs who will be our guides across our agenda. Dr. James Orbinski for Global Health, the Honorable Anne McClellan, Canada's former Deputy Prime Minister for Shared Prosperity, the Honorable Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London for Inclusive Societies, Frans Timmermans, First Vice President of the European Commission for Sustainability, and the Right Honorable Helle Thorning-Schmidt, former Prime Minister of Denmark for Democracy and Institutions. They will help guide our impressive list of speakers and idea pitchers who are streaming in from all around the world, from London to Budapest, Montreal to Geneva, Chicago to Berlin, Canberra to Auckland. We have an impressive lineup for you. And that actually brings me to you, our audience. You are a crucial part of this program. We want to hear from you throughout, and you can do that first in 3 ways. First, you can stream our program daily. We are broadcasting from Canada 2020's YouTube channel, so subscribe to get updates about our videos. Second, we want you to share and amplify this program with your network on your social channels. And finally, engage directly with our panelists. Our team has set up a Slido event for you to easily ask us questions and raise ideas. So go to slido.com and enter the tag Recovery Summit to reach us. So thank you very much for tuning in. We are very excited to get started. And to do that, Matt, I'm going to hand things over to you in London to officially kick off our first session. Matt.
Alex, thank you very much. My setup here in London is a little bit less sophisticated than yours over there in Ottawa, and so I think we can see which team is sort of driving the technology behind all of this today. So I'd like to just sort of extend my thanks again to you and your team for helping pull this together as well. It really would not be possible without you. I don't want to take too much time up front here, but what I would like to say is we have a tradition at the sort of Global Progress Canada 2020 gatherings of always beginning our discussions founded in some facts, in some opinions that have been sought from across the globe. So why we are going to focus on the recovery, ideas that drive the recovery, and how we can build a political coalition to help advance and advocate for those ideas. What we want to do is we want to found that discussion in a debate about what the public feel, what they feel they have learned about themselves, about their societies, their economies, and their democracies from this crisis, and use that as a basis to understand what they hope and expect their political leaders and their policymakers to do as we look to build back better, to recover from this crisis. So I can't think of a better person to help us lead us through that discussion, or at least to start that discussion, than Tim Dixon, who is one of the co-founders of More in Common. More in Common, many of you may know, is an organization that's very dear to my heart. It was founded after the brutal murder of Jo Cox, a British MP who grew up in Yorkshire near myself, and the term More in Common is based around her opening address to the UK Parliament, in which she said that we have far more in common than that which divides us. I think that is a great motto, a great starting point for this conversation. And so I'm delighted that Tim has joined us. Those of you familiar to Global Progress debates will also be familiar with Tim. He is a longtime partner in a number of our events and many of our discussions. He has served in a variety of different roles. He was an advisor to a number of Australian prime ministers. He trained as a lawyer. He started a publishing house. He was the founder of Purpose Europe and helped build a number of organizations that worked on issues dealing on everything from Syria to civic engagement and refugees. And yeah, I also consider him a personal friend. Tim is, of course, now the co-founder of More in Common, and he will talk to us about a recent survey that they have conducted across 7 countries, looking at how people have responded to COVID, what they felt they have learned about themselves, their societies, and their economies, and what they hope to see coming out of this crisis. So Tim, I believe you're also in London. Thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thanks, Alex. And thanks for bringing us together for the Recovery Summit. It's not as exciting sitting in my living room than being in Montreal, but I think one upside of this format is obviously our ability to reach much larger audiences than what we have in the past with sort of closed-door conferences. And so I think this is a great way of taking advantage of the opportunity to open up our conversation. So thanks to the team at Canada 2020, at Global Progress, and at IFSD. So our goal in this session is, over a few moments, to set a context for the conversation about recovery in the future that'll take place over the coming sessions. And what I would like to do is provide some insights on a range of different issues around the directions of public opinions and public attitudes for these very strange times that we live in. I'm going to provide a sneak peek at findings of a major study that More in Common is releasing on Thursday. And just by way of 60-second explanation, building on what Matt said, our work, More in Common, it's an organisation that has teams in 4 of the largest Western democracies in the US, UK, France, and Germany. Our work is focused on uniting divided societies and understanding the forces that drive democratic societies apart and how we can bring them back together. And the name More in Common, as Matt mentioned, comes from Jo Cox, the murdered British Labour MP. So we do a lot of work on the psychology of populations. We publish a lot of research. We have around 60 partnerships with different institutions to bring those insights to life. We're a non-partisan organisation, though my own background, as Matt has mentioned, is working on progressive campaigns across several countries and for some years in a Prime Minister's office. So what we're going to pull out is insights that are most useful for progressives in terms of policy, in terms of communications. And so we'll kick off with the slide here that gives us an outline of the issues that I'm going to run through, which is sort of 10 issues. But broadly, this study that's being released on Thursday and what's at the heart of our work is seeking to answer the question of how do we build resilience to the threats to democracy in this moment? How do we make our democracies work better? How do we restore public trust and confidence and build resilience to the threats against us? And I'm going to go through these 10 points here just to sort of to bring out some key elements of the findings that we'll be sharing publicly on Thursday. It's a study of 14,000 people across 7 countries, the US, UK, Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, and it's going to be released in all of the languages, so French, German, Italian, Polish, and Dutch later this week, as well as English. And our goal with the study is really to identify how are our societies changing, how are public attitudes changing in response to COVID, 6 months down now as we are from the beginning of the lockdown or quarantine or shelter in place period. So it's getting a sense of the overall direction of public opinion post-COVID, whether the public has an appetite for change. Are people more desperate just to return to the way things were before the pandemic? Have public attitudes towards government change, towards policy priorities, towards policy options? And a good part of our work is around how do we understand and counter the appeal of us versus them political narratives. Alongside that is looking at what are the common ground strategies that can resist division. So we're paying close attention to issues such as immigration, diversity, national identity, climate change, the economy, all issues that in a sense have the potential to either unite us or to divide us. So let's jump in. Where has COVID left us? 6 months in from the beginning of the lockdown period. It's been a time, I guess, where there's a sense of unreality about this moment, because many people are only just beginning to experience the consequences in terms of the economic consequences of the pandemic as the wage subsidy schemes taper off in various countries. But what you can see here is that there's very high levels of anxiety about the future, really resulting from 3 sources of uncertainty. The first is health, around the second wave of infections and lockdowns. Now, the research was undertaken a few weeks before the last 3 weeks where we've seen the big surge in cases in many European countries. And it reflects the overall finding that we have that the concern in the public is much more around things moving too fast, the sort of relaxation of restrictions moving too fast than moving too slowly, even though often you hear the opposite in media reports. Secondly, there's a lot of concern about the economic fallout. The consequences individually is generally much smaller than the consequences people perceive for the whole economy, but the fear of a major recession or depression that could last a long period of time. And the fear also of social division and political instability, which is particularly pronounced in the US. And you can see why there's so much anxiety and anger in the United States, because it's such a bad picture on all 3 fronts: health, economy, and division. Though notice there is some nuance here as well. For example, the Italians are more concerned about the economic outlook, the Americans and French about division, British, Italians and Americans about the further waves of COVID. So there is a sort of a nuance as well as just high levels of anxiety across the board. Let's jump into one other aspect just in the United States while we're talking about the issues of concern and division. In the US, there's anxiety about the conduct of the election, which is another layer of concern on top of those other really profound concerns about where things are going. We've been running a day-to-day panel in the US since April, where we have a 100 people representative group of Americans, and we ask them about all sorts of issues about their lives, issues that are going on in public debates, some politics, some social issues, to get us a sense of how their lives are changing from day to day and how they're feeling. And the sense of exhaustion around division, the sense of uncertainty about the election is so palpable. There was a few weeks ago, a young Republican woman from Wyoming who articulated this, I think, better than anybody else that I've seen in the group, when she said, in her words, almost every single system we have in America is broken. Healthcare, education, justice. I have no faith in our election process. It feels like I'm in the beginning chapters of a dystopian novel. And that is true of many people in America. We particularly focus on not just those loud voices that we hear most on social media, but what we call the exhausted majority that you can see in the colourful sort of breakdown on the right of the slide here. And they're particularly important because they don't have a tribal view of things, but they're just incredibly anxious about current conditions and just exhausted by particularly the division. And I think that it's a reflection that the messaging of the Biden campaign speaks very much to that sentiment that we've been picking up over the last couple of years, really, and that's very acute this year. But a couple more dimensions to this. 2/3 of Americans believe that foreign interference is likely in the election, and that's quite widely held, that belief. But polarization influences everyone's perceptions. So the concern is about half among the conservative groups than it is in the rest of the population. And like many other issues, there's strong polarization on this issue. So, for example, when we've got this breakdown here of the 7 groups, the 7 segments that in the Hidden Tribes work that we've done in the US, we've found this very predictive of where people stand on such a wide range of issues over the past 2 years since we did this breakdown. It provides lots of insights. But what's particularly significant is that election interference and the conduct of the election just falls into exactly the same patterns, where you've got 95% concern among progressive activists and traditional liberals, and only a third as much, 30% levels of concern in the conservative groups. But again, that's not the only story. It's not a 50-50 story. You've got the middle exhausted majority groups who do have high levels of concern. Interestingly, the highest level of concern that is actually around social media interference. So if we look at the next slide, these findings are actually not from what we're releasing this week. It's a different project where we'll be releasing findings next month around election integrity. But it's striking here, the single strongest fear among Americans relating to the election is that social media is going to be used to turn us against each other. And while it's strong among progressives, it's a concern that's shared by 4 in 5 conservatives as well. And that's more evidence of the anxiety in the country and the extent of division. It was recently, I think last week it was in Florida, there was a survey by a Democratic consultant that showed that division is the #1 concern of voters in Florida. So that tells us something about the partisan division over the threat of foreign interference, but also you've got the hacking of voting systems, providing intelligence to election campaigns, the issues that the president's repeatedly underplayed, where that polarization comes through again. Next, looking on the shifts that we're picking up in conversations as a result of COVID, it's striking that people generally feel that we have become more concerned about each other out of this period. And that's one of the ways in which I think the COVID has opened up a different environment to which progressive values can really speak. It's especially true in the United Kingdom, where there's been a very strong surge of mutual aid efforts and voluntary work, 53% feeling that we've become more concerned about each other, independent of the fact that there's actually quite a strong judgment on the performance of the government. So there's an interesting dimension here where people are thinking about their societies in ways that aren't just tied to the way that they're seeing their politics or their government sort of play out. Only in the United States are there as many people who think that our concern for each other has worsened as much as it's improved. There's also greater awareness of the living conditions of other people, of inequality, the lives of fellow citizens. That's due not just to COVID-19, I think it's also the impact of the movements around Black lives and racial justice. Around 3 in 5 people say that, yes, I am more aware of other people's lives now. And that's obviously in part about health workers and essential workers who had to go into work and who were exposed to the virus when the rest of us were in lockdown. But it's also just a more general impact of thinking about how people catch the virus, people living in more crowded conditions, people suddenly not having money for food, and having to look after their family. And it also, you see on the right here, this seems to have reinforced a basic message of humanity, that as humans, we're fundamentally the same no matter where we are from. And just as a sort of side observation, we find repeatedly that speaking about the commonality, the similarity between us, is so much more powerful and has so much more support than always emphasizing diversity and difference between different groups within society. 3/4 of people everywhere agree with that sentiment. But there's also a sense of frustration with the failure of governments. The different experiences with COVID-19 have led to very different perceptions in the public mood across countries. So German and Dutch populations have been left with a real sense of pride in their country's management of the crisis. It's a very different situation in the US, UK, France, and Poland. There's disappointment, there's frustration. Italy is interesting and is a more mixed picture, but I think that, you know, what comes out and is most striking about this, and with a lot of the conclusions from the 7-country study, is just the weakness of the position that the United States is in. If we look at public confidence in in government's ability to tackle challenges, it's really taken a battering, both in terms of our trust in others, our trust in government, although again, it's very different for countries like Germany and the Netherlands. Trust has eroded because of the perception of incompetence, the perception of secrecy, media distortions. And one consequence of this, which we've found in asking about whether people will take a vaccine, is that 1 in 3 people say they wouldn't get a vaccine, even if it becomes available. And that this issue of declining trust in the capability of governments, it's not just about the specific government in power, it's also a question about whether governments are able to deliver on big changes and big systems. And that's why, from a progressive perspective, I think it's really important to look at policies that don't rely on trust in the power of big government, because that's really not where people are at. They have more faith at the moment, especially in local communities. So where policies can come through, can be more localized, can come through people in the institutions that people trust more, they're likely to resonate more, because there's this deep skepticism about government's ability to deliver change, but there's more confidence at the local level, as we'll see in a moment. In terms of looking at the performance of how governments rank, you can see that on competence and fairness, there's quite a spread here. The US ranks worse, both incompetent and unfair. The German and Dutch governments rank well. Perhaps the most interesting nuance here is the UK, which is ranked as a very incompetent government, but not especially unfair, which is a classic piece of British nuance, I think, in the perception of government. There isn't a blame about motivation. There's just a sense that, yeah, so many things have gone wrong. But more broadly, in terms of the sentiment around the overall story of change, we wanted to get a sense of whether the public mood is, this is a time for big change, to make significant changes to fix things, or is there a feeling that there's so much anxiety and uncertainty that people just want things to go back to normal? And the answer to that is that the perception is, on balance, more towards wanting change, but it is more pronounced in countries which have struggled with the pandemic, and it's weaker in countries that have done well. And the gap here isn't huge. It's about 55-45 overall across all countries. I don't think it's a desire for a sort of big visionary optimistic change. It's a bit more grim in a sense. It's a sense of, well, there's things that are broken we need to fix, and that needs to start with our health system, and then it needs to go to jobs. And I think it's quite possible too that this sentiment could shift in the other direction. It could be more of a back to normal, back to how things were, back to a sense of security, if change is not framed in a way that has broad appeal. That is, if it only speaks to a limited number of sort of segments of the population. One other thing to note here is that people want change, but most people don't actually believe that change is going to happen, especially not in France, where there's a real desire for change, great skepticism that anything is going to be different. The only country which actually believes where a majority believe significant change is going to happen is actually the United States, which is interesting and perhaps good news, but maybe also a reflection that people struggle to imagine that things could actually be worse. If we look at people's priorities for the future, this is a sort of complex picture, and I won't go into the detail, but just to say in short that the general priorities that emerge across countries is around health, jobs, and climate, and the various different measures that can be taken to support families, small businesses, etc., and the economic fallout. In the US, it's a different picture. In all of our countries, we've asked people about their priorities for the future, but outside of the United States, the answers are clearer. In the US, free and fair elections rank as the second most important, but the story about people's priorities is most of all the story of just real polarization, a very different set of issues for people on the conservative end to people on the sort of liberal and progressive end. Perhaps the most interesting finding about priorities that came through from our research, we'd actually picked it up not long after the period of quarantine had started, is that people have seen a connection between climate and the experience of nature in lockdown, that they have seen that there is real human agency, that the way that we behave as humans has a real impact on our environment. And the reduction in pollution, the return of nature, has translated into people saying, we really need to do more on climate. And not just we need to, but we can. It can make a difference. And there is a sense of people not wanting to return to how things were in a very specific way around being more connected to nature, and not just something as well that you pick up in sort of middle class or upper middle class segments. We've been doing this with disengaged segments in France, for example, and this is a really quite interesting nuanced change that has taken place around feeling more connected to nature. And that translates as well into people's perceptions of environmental policy, that people don't think their governments are doing enough on the environment. Very few people think that their governments are actually doing too much. There's surprisingly positive findings in terms of showing that the identity wars are not undermining support for action on the environment or climate in Europe. But this is something that we're doing a lot of work on right now around language, around talking about the environment, nature, countryside, etc., in ways that have broad appeal and don't just project a set of more liberal values that may not be shared by the whole of populations. But certainly it's a more optimistic picture in European countries that climate is the efforts to bring climate into identity wars is not working, is not penetrating all that far, whereas of course that's very well established in the US. That said, even in the United States, there is majority support for the Green New Deal. It's only 54%, so it's only just above the 50%, but it's striking. But much higher levels of support, mostly in the 70s in Europe. And that makes sense then of the way in which the bailout funds that the European Commission has announced are going to be focused on digitalisation and on decarbonising economies. When we look at the priorities for bailout policies, for the government aid to businesses, it's very striking how strongly the public expects that there needs to be something in return. If governments are giving money, then they need to get something back. And so we've asked this question about action on fair wages for essential workers, on onshoring jobs, on capping CEO salaries, on reducing carbon emissions, and on paying tax locally, paying your fair taxes, not using tax havens. And there is almost unanimous support for almost all of those policies, particularly high on the fair wages and the issue of tax havens. And I think that gives us some insight into where there is opportunity for policy change, particularly in connection with the way in which we approach the recovery period. Another dimension of the findings that we've seen both in our focus group conversations and in the large-scale quantitative research is just how much people have been thinking more about their local community through the experience of the pandemic. They're much more optimistic about what they've seen locally than national. It's particularly pronounced in the US, and you can see here twice as much pride in what they've seen locally than they've seen nationally. But there's also that general sort of theme of localism we've found emerge in all of our countries, even in countries where the national effort has been relatively successful in its response. And I think that this is a time for a rethinking and a rebalancing of the role that centralized power versus localized power can take place, and thinking of democratizing experiments at that local level. That sense of localism also translates into the way people think that money should be spent. So we asked specifically about whether COVID recovery funds, such as for job creation, should go through national governments or local governments, or it should be through a shared effort. And the answer in every country is a shared effort. But local government's more trusted than national government in every single country except for the Netherlands. That's also reflected here in the measures of trust in national governments and local governments. And the finding here is that there has been a real loss of confidence overall in in national governments through the experience of the pandemic. And I think it's worth surfacing this as a challenge for governments that want to deliver on an ambitious agenda. The good news here is that trust in local governments has not been as starkly affected, And that means that there is more opportunity for innovation. And of course, that's also relevant in many countries where progressive governments are not in power nationally and have little prospect nationally, but where they may be able to win at a localized or state or provincial level. Another dimension that's interesting in the findings, it sort of belongs to a very specific set of circumstances with the global pandemic, is whether people have turned inwards or outwards with the experience of the pandemic. Have these failures of leadership turned them away from cooperation, international cooperation, and towards greater nativism or not? And the answer seems to be no. The sentiment that we have now is an unusual combination of more support for multilateralism, a sense that we need more international cooperation, about 70% support for that approach, alongside support for strong border controls and keeping immigration at low levels. So this is an unusual combination. It doesn't sort of fit into traditional way in which we might think about internationalism. People think that go it alone is not a smart approach, but at the same time, they feel much safer when there is strong control on borders, because the lens through which they're seeing everything right now is a public health lens. There is also, I don't mention it in the slides here, but there is a disappointment with the European Union, particularly in the case of the Italy, and a real anger about the performance of the EU, its failure to help in the early stages of the pandemic. But majorities still see stronger European Union action as the way out of the crisis, ranging from about 60 to 75% across countries. In contrast, it's not a time for pushing for immigration reforms or for opening up of borders. Immigration is not being seen through the lens of xenophobia, but rather through the lens of the pandemic and the safety for a local population. We've seen this in the qualitative research where we've talked to people where they say we need to do more to protect migrant populations within our country, because they are more vulnerable. At the same time, they say, but we absolutely need to keep control, close our borders. This is not a time where it's safe for people to be moving across borders. So it's a different, again, it's different from a sort of open, closed value set. On the positive side, migrants are not being blamed for the spread of the virus. I haven't included the slides here, but we've asked a lot of questions around blame and culpability, because we want this research to serve as a sort of early warning system on what narratives might take hold, divisive narratives. Right now, migrants are not being blamed, a little bit in Italy, but besides that, that sort of narrative isn't taking hold. But equally, people are very nervous about the prospect of increasing migration. Last thing that I want to do is just to touch on some of the dangers around the current environment that we're in. The experience of the global financial crisis in 2008 showed us that the backlash that can take place doesn't come immediately around a crisis. It often emerges over a period of years afterwards, but we need to be much more attentive than we were 12 years ago to that prospect of different insurgent forces, anti-democratic forces rising up, spreading blame narratives, dividing societies. And this is something that we particularly focus on through the lens of the segments of population, because we have identified with Warren Common's work in a series of our national studies, the group of people that we call invisibles, or sort of disengaged populations, generally around 30–40% of the voting population that's disengaged. And that has a particular set of characteristics. It doesn't sort of fit into an easy political category of left or right. They are more distinguished by their attitude towards society, very low levels of trust, not really having a strong political identity. Often personally, they're quite lonely. They have a lack of belonging. They have a sense of exclusion. They don't feel represented. They're not hopeful about politics. They tend to be younger, although they have an age spread, particularly really sort of under 40s. They're less politically attached. Very different. And in fact, there's more young people in this group than there are young people who sort of believe in the support, the progressive, more activist voices that often we see in media. And there's a real crisis emerging, I think, through that age cohort in many countries where they just have a less faith in democracy, less faith in the system. What this research shows here is that in France, we've identified the identitarian group, which is the sort of the group that most supports the far right. We have identified a disengaged group called the Left Behind, who sort of increasingly resemble the behaviour and the beliefs of the identitarians, with very low levels of trust, a sense of deep disappointment in the system. And that's very dangerous, because where you see the disengaged groups aligning to the identitarian or sort of far-right supporting groups, you're looking at a quite significant proportion of the population being willing to support an insurgent. It may not be, in the case of France, for example, it may not be the National Rally, it may be some sort of five-star movement equivalent, some form of insurgent populism. But I just think this underlying lack of faith in the system and in democracy is a real concern. So that gives some perspective on what the picture is like in France. We can also see the same picture in Germany. And the picture here is that where we look at the different segments within Germany, we find that there's a group that feels more on its own, more isolated and distant and distrustful of the system. One group called the Angry, which is the sort of the base of support for the Alternative for Germany group. But then the group that we call the Disillusion is increasingly close to the group, the Angry group. And again, when you put those groups together, you have around a third of the population. So they resemble, in terms of their views of a sense of low trust in government. They don't think that people care about them. Just 43% faith compared to 38% of the Angry. 65%, if we jump to the next one, the Disillusioned don't believe that politicians care about people like them, which is not very different from the 83% view of the Angry. They think things are unfair. So out of all of that, those findings in Germany, the warning here is that there is a real threat of insurgency, even in countries actually that have done very well in the handling of the pandemic. And that's why we believe there's a real need for us to do all we can to be building cohesion and solidarity in a time of profound uncertainty. But at that point, I'll pass it back to Matt.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was a very comprehensive and wide-ranging discussion and presentation, helping us start off our discussions for today. I think, interestingly, what you see there is some cause for optimism, a sense that there is a desire for change, but also you quite clearly point to some apparent dangers in some country that this may not lead in a progressive direction, but actually provide a window of opportunity amongst those that are frustrated or increasingly angry with the system to actually be a bit more of a reactionary change. So I think a cause for caution as well as some hope there. So thanks. We're going to now start the follow-up panel. You've given us some great data to base that on. And this panel will be looking to see how we can ensure that we shape a progressive response to the recovery. So Tim will now be joined by two colleagues from North America. The first is Neera Tanden, who many of you may know is the president and CEO of the Center for American Progress. Neera is a longtime Democratic strategist and advocate. She worked at the Department of Health and Human Services on the Obamacare bill. She worked previously for Hillary Clinton and advised a number of presidents, including President Barack Obama. Neera is joining us from Washington. Neera, if you can turn on your camera and audio, that would be wonderful. And then in Ottawa, we are also joined by Jerry Butts. Jerry Butts is the vice chairman of the Eurasia Group. Eurasia is a geopolitical political risk management company. Jerry advises Fortune 500 companies there on global trends and political risk. As many of you know, he has also been the principal secretary to the Prime Minister of Canada and to the Premier of Ontario. And prior to that, he was the president of the World Wildlife Foundation Canada. So Jerry, also welcome. For those of you who don't follow Jerry on Twitter as well, it's also worth mentioning that he is a keen Cape Bretoner and will often mention that on his tweets. So Neera, Jerry, thank you so much for joining us. Unfortunately, Astrid Panazayan, who was due to join us from Paris, who is one of the co-founders of En Marche, has been withheld, but we do hope that she'll be able to join us later in the summit program later in the week. So look, I'm going to start by coming to you, Neera, if I may, although I see you've just stood up, but Neera's not on. Okay, so let me come then to Jerry, given that Neera has left. This is not the choreography that we'd agreed, but Jerry, you will have seen through some of the data presented by Tim, although that wasn't referencing Canada, that there's both cause for optimism, but there's a sense in which many people still feel that we are a long way out from sort of recovery, that the pandemic and the economic, social, as well as the public health consequences have quite a way to run ahead still. So I wondered if you'd be willing to share with us your views on how you see this evolving, how the Canadians see the current situation, and what you think the sort of goal should be as we try and forge a progressive response in Canada. Jerry, welcome.
Sure, thanks very much, Matt. And I see Neera up there now, so I'll wave to her. It's good to see Neera. And good luck in all your efforts in the next few months. I would make a couple of points off the top that we can then come back to, and I'll share a bit of research that we're doing right now. So it's hot off the press for Canada 2020. The first point, that's probably the most important one, is to understand and really appreciate the level of anxiety that people are going through, right? In particular, in the progressive movement, where we depend on the support of the broad middle class and regular people, and when we keep that support, we form governments, and when we don't, we lose governments. It's really important to emphasize what we're doing and whom we are doing it for, rather than celebrate the fact that we are doing it. So as someone put it to me, a colleague in the UK put it to me on the weekend, not to name names, Matt, we have to emphasize the object in the sentence, not the subject in the sentence. So what is going through people's minds? Here in Canada, and if we can share this slide, I don't know if people can see that now, Matt. Okay, terrific. So this is hot off the press. This is research we're doing to be shared in a broader study for Canada 2020 sometime in the next few weeks. We've been trying to get after where Canadians self-assess their position in the midst of this crisis. So we came up with this lovely visual where we describe the beginning of the crisis as dusk, and Canadians who tell us where they believe they were personally and their country was coming through that crisis, coming through the pandemic. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see where people think we are. Sorry, is my connection breaking up?
You're fine now.
Okay. If we could go to the next slide, Alex. Okay, great. So as you can see, despite a lot of opinion leader commentary, the Canadian public generally thinks we're right smack dab in the middle of this thing. I saw other research shared this morning from Abacus that had a similar assessment, and even indicated that people's assessment of being in the middle of the crisis, or the worst is yet to come, I think was the phraseology they used, has ticked up since the spring. So why is this an important ground to build out from? To put it, diplomatically, I think that in any crisis situation, people will repurpose their pet projects as urgent and necessary responses to the crisis of the moment, the crisis at hand. And it's vitally important that when people are feeling as anxious as they're feeling right now, we start the solutions from where they are and build up from there, and not arrive in the middle of their anxiety with a pre-existing solution that was developed and determined before the crisis that has arisen. All that said, I think it's really important, in particular, this is something that countries all over the world are dealing with, and it's certainly something that at Eurasia Group we're working with clients on various macro trends that are affecting their investments and their businesses. But in particular in Canada, and I'll get into these a bit later in the panel discussion, the three major macro trends that we need to keep our eye on are, one, an acceleration of inequality and unfairness in the global economy. We have been saying since the beginning of this crisis that it's not reversing trends, it's acting as an accelerant for pre-existing trends. You've even seen some people start to talk about a K-shaped recovery, where the top end of the economy is taking off and barely feeling the crisis, and the bottom end of the economy is, the bottom half of the economy is feeling it in a uniquely negative way. The second, of course, is the energy transition and climate change. It's remarkable what's happened to conventional energy markets since the beginning of the crisis. One of the most important trends here for Canada is NERA's party's positioning on climate change going into this campaign. The Biden policy, $2 trillion to decarbonize the American electricity sector, is something that would have been unthinkable for the nominee of either major party as recently as one cycle ago. And I think that's not just a reflection of strong advocacy work in the grassroots of the Democratic Party and among organizations like the Sunrise Movement. It shows that there's just a radical reordering of facts on the ground going on in the United States. As we speak on this panel, there are five cyclones in the Atlantic Basin, and most of the west coast of the United States is suffering air quality levels from historic forest fires that they've never seen. I think yesterday Vancouver was one of the top three, was one of the three cities with the worst air quality in the world. And people are, of course, not stupid. Those of you who know me know I'm a subscriber to the school of politics, that what I call the PANS school of politics. People are not stupid, and they're reacting to what they see around them, no matter how much money is spent to convince them otherwise. And then, of course, the last trend for Canada is what exactly is happening in the United States, Nira, and I look forward to your reflections on that. I think that's a really important trend in and of itself, but nested within that trend is, of course, the decoupling of the US-China relationship and a radical reordering of trade patterns associated with that. So, when I sit back and reflect on this, I think that any of these three trends, had they been happening on their own, would have presented enormous challenges for public policymakers. The fact that they are all three happening at the same time and at a velocity approaching terminal velocity presents a really unique and challenging time to be making policy. So I think the most important thing when you find yourself in the midst of that is to deeply understand what people are going through and build the policy apparatus that you want to help them out from their experiences. And the experience of Canadians in particular, but also Europeans, Americans, is one of profound anxiety and uncertainty about the future. Now is the time to be delivering security, clarity, and both liquidity support in the short term for households and long-term planning support to manage through these big macro trends. And so much depends on what happens in the United States. And Nira, that's a good pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Jerry, and for that view from Ottawa. And I mean, yeah, it's clear, Nira, that the fate of much more than the United States rests on what's likely to happen over the next few months in your election. We feel it in London, people feel it in Canberra and Auckland, they feel it in Paris, Berlin, as much as they do in Ottawa. So please, I'll cede the floor to you now to share your views on where you think the political and policy debate is going in the United States and what hope progressives should have over the next few months. Thanks for
well, I really appreciate, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this forum. And over the last several years, as we've struggled in the United States with, essentially an authoritarian right-wing populist as president, it's been really helpful for us to learn from other countries, even though we daily experience the uniqueness of the Trump administration. And so I actually just really appreciate the data and commentary so far. I'd say I think it really dovetails well with not just the data that we have on the United States, but the campaigns, the Biden campaign as it's being waged right now. And I think the most important issue for progressives going forward, and I really take this point about where the data is that was laid out, is, I do think the virus is a national, is a global disaster. Each country is experiencing it nationally, but it is a unique form of national disaster. And in my view, I think this goes to a specific set of progressive policies. And what I mean by that is a pandemic, unlike the coronavirus, unlike an economic crisis or even a national disaster crisis, is an issue in which the decisions of individuals affect everybody else. And I mean, if just as an example, other countries with stronger welfare states don't have to face these choices, but in the United States, where we don't have universal paid leave and we don't have universal sick days, people deciding when they're not feeling well to go to work can infect large groups of people. And so I think this has really shifted the perspective on why we need an effective governmental response. And again, that's also happening at the same time where we have the most ineffective government response and people are seeing the results. So I think that this actually, spells two things, one for the election and one for governing. For the election, I think it means, and you see this in the trend lines, people are much more open to a governmental response. I take the caution about a federal government response versus a local government response, but given where the federal government has been, that is highly rational for voters right now because the federal government has fundamentally failed. Going forward, I think this is a real question for, or a real challenge and opportunity for, if there is a Biden administration. I'll get to how we get there in a minute, but if there is a Biden administration, I think this is a once in a generational opportunity for progressives to prove that government can work through an effective strategy to fight the virus. And the conditions are such that we could really end the Reagan era dominant view that the federal government is always a problem and never an aid. That view has shifted over the last several years. A majority of Americans and other polling that's been taking place annually over the last 4 or 5 years want a stronger federal government response to the nation's problems over wanting a weaker one. But this is the virus plus those underlying trends, I think, provide a real opportunity for for a Biden administration, in which I'm knocking on wood. But how do we get to the Biden administration? I think this, obviously, if people in Berlin and Ottawa are concerned about this election, I can guarantee you every progressive in the United States is concerned. I think the Biden campaign has skillfully put forward plans that deal with the virus itself, deal with the economy itself, but as they say, build back better, do so in a way that strengthens our ability to solve problems for the long term. And the $2 trillion specified by the Biden campaign to invest in climate is a good example. Joe Biden today is doing a big climate event in which he's going to talk about the California fires, his climate plan, and also how we can essentially address these problems in a way that creates, that's more sustainable for the country, addresses the climate change problem, and actually also reduces inequality. I think that kind of climate plan is possible because people are much more open to large scale federal investment in problems. And we've seen that. I mean, what's shifted the ground is that Republicans and Democrats came together in the spring and passed a massive governmental bailout of the economy. And the traditional arguments of the right fell away in the face of that problem. And I think that has been a proof point for why larger scale federal investments are really important. So my take on, where we are in the electorate and where we are over the next several, 50 days is that, the tectonic shifts in the United States are such that there is a majority that has been opposed to Donald Trump for 4 years. He has never had majority support in the country. His strategy is to change the electorate by voter suppression so that a minority will can actually reflect the majority by keeping the majority will suppressed. And so I don't really think that we're in a mode where he's going for a big majority at this point because of his alienation amongst different groups. And I think that Biden has skillfully, basically assessed this kind of data that's been laid out and put forward a plan that does deal with structural problems, does deal with larger scale problems. And because Biden has had a moderate kind of, both he's had a moderate reputation and he was a moderate in the primaries, it's his kind of large scale investments, his economic program is voters are much more open to it than maybe other candidates. And I'll just say one last point. The big challenge that I think the Biden campaign has is, in the world that we're in the United States, where Trump has so much media domination, is it possible for him to? The real challenge is, breaking through. And Biden now has the resources, but we need. That is, I think, the biggest challenge for him. People just need to understand how he's going to make their lives better, and I think the debates are a real opportunity for that. And obviously, Trump will, have a variety of tricks to deploy. But I think the reality is that Biden's plans are aligned with the majority, and people are much more open. He has a real opportunity to create a large-scale progressive majority. But of course, it's most important just to get to 270. So that I'll send it back to you, Matt.
Thanks, Neera. Thanks. I'd like to turn to Tim now, if I may. Tim, your organization, More in Common, has also done a lot of work on the media environment, the gap between what happens on social media and in the regular media. And Neera's closing point was, how does President Biden break through? How do we actually get in some way, informed debate among the electorate around the options facing us and the kind of opportunities and change that we wish to move forward? I wonder if, from your research, you have any insights that you'd like to share on that matter.
Yeah, what has struck me, this is going to sound like a strange observation, but having been, politically obsessed all my life, the biggest single thing I think I've learned in the last couple of years we do a ton of qualitative research across different countries, is just realizing that the majority of people, I'm always stuck in the conversations around highly engaged people, and our conversation is basically about governments and people. It's that kind of conversation. And it's realizing after sitting through hours and hours of focus groups and talking to people, that that's just like an abnormal view of seeing the world. Most people look at the world through the lens of society, and even in focus groups, mostly they're talking about each other. And that is one aspect, sort of goes to Jerry's point around what is people's experience right now? What are they experiencing, and how do we ground solutions in that sort of resonate with them? And that's one aspect of it. Now, what does that mean in practice? It means that actually in most countries, they're not talking about politics. They're talking about each other. And as politics sort of comes into the way that they think about the rest of society, they think about politics, but it's not the main focus. And I think to some extent, that is something that social media is constantly pushing us in the other direction, because when we're in those highly engaged sort of Twitter wars, that conversation is always a conversation about politics and so disconnected from people's lives. Why COVID was really important was because people have been hearing a very negative story about their societies for so long, partly because of social media. Social media is always elevating these extreme voices. So we see, 100 people do a rally against face masks, and we think that this is like whole huge movement of people away. Well, we ask questions about people's social distancing practices, and even in the US, it's like 83% of people are following the rules. But there's this perception that there's this large number of people who are not. And what initially happened with COVID was this: people saw lots of mutual aid efforts and generosity, and they got suddenly optimistic about maybe the world isn't so crazy and maybe, you know, most people around me are quite good. And unfortunately, then what cut in, I mean, in the US, particularly because of the politics of the administration, Trump's kind of constantly just sending divisive messages as how he rules. But elsewhere as well, there was a sense of, oh no, maybe actually there's just like all these kind of reckless, irresponsible people. But a lot of that conversation was still about each other and their behavior rather than about government. And I think that understanding that piece and thinking of the issues that we talk about through the lens of other people, and how do you, in a sense, you know, how do you get behind and encourage the pro-social behavior and the goodness of the large majority of people in the community. Finding ways into that sort of conversation would actually in many ways resonate more than starting with thinking policy or politics.
Jerry, I saw you raise your hand, so please do come in, follow up.
I have to continually unmute myself. You know, I think that's actually a bit reflected in the campaigns. I mean, I think Biden has really talked about, you know, things like just wearing a mask, he's run ads about wearing a mask and how important it is to have a commitment to each other. And I do think that we can talk about policy, but if we step back, this campaign in the United States has been less focused on policy. It's much more, Biden has run a campaign that is much more about character and ethos, and it's really about unity versus division. He's used his biography skillfully, repetitively to talk about unity. You know, I think there was a real debate in the Democratic primary about whether to try to unify the country or, you know, just marshal the base of the Democratic Party. You know, he really won that debate. And so I think this way that people are seeing each other, and in many ways, the way that they are affected by the division has been a central component of the critique of Trump. But it's one in which Biden is also talking about the kind of, you know, leader he'll be and it's not just what he's saying, but the way he's running his campaign and organizing himself to be responsible, to try to reach out to different groups. I think reach out to Trump voters. So the point you make about how people are seeing themselves, I think is really reflected. I think is a really important one, and one that I think the campaign acknowledges and understands. I mean, it's just odd to have ads running where a presidential candidate is just talking about what people should do to protect themselves against the virus. I mean, there's a critique of Trump's handling of the virus, but the plan is, you know, what he's just talking about how important it is for everyone to wear a mask. I mean, I think at some level that's just an abject failure of our current president, but it also is an indication how important the virus is, how people see that, and how the divisiveness really bothers them. And it's another kind of proof point for Biden.
Thank you. Jerry.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something that Tim said and Neera echoed, and that is, you know, in the early days of this crisis and the pandemic, I was struck by a couple of things. The first and most important was what different groups of citizens were being told to do as their civic duty. So if you're a member of a profession where, frankly, like all of us on this stage are paid to write and think and talk for a living, we were told our civic duty was to go to our relatively comfortable homes and stay there, right? And if you worked on the supply chain that got people like us food so that we could stay in our homes, or other essentials of life in the early part of the pandemic, you were told, and you were paid relatively poorly to do it, you were told that your civic duty was to go out and risk your health and the health of your family to make sure that we could continue to do our jobs. And I think that, again, people are not stupid. And in both camps, that reflects a radically different experience of what this pandemic was like. And it's going to leave a durable mark on everybody involved, in particular the people who had to go to work in what they considered to be relatively unsafe conditions, who just happened to be also amongst the most disadvantaged and vulnerable people in all of our countries. So I think that puts a special, this gets to the point that Neera was making on the strategic choice that the Biden campaign has made to be almost not quite a translator, but to make sure that those two camps, at least in the American body politic, don't sever from one another, and to constantly remind everybody that we're all in the same boat. And I think that gets to the second reflection about the experience of the pandemic. I agree with Neera and Tim. I don't think that people are thinking about politics at all. And the more that politics intrudes on their everyday life, the more negatively predisposed they become toward politics and politicians. And we need to be very, very careful about that. I think, when you look at we did the study at Eurasia Group looking at the bounce that leaders across the world got after the pandemic struck. And it was really interesting. After a while, when you tracked it a couple of months, you realized you weren't measuring the support for any given individual leader within any individual country. What you were really measuring was the extent to which people within that country could transcend their partisan viewpoints in a time of crisis. So in Canada, which is thankfully one of the least partisan countries in the world, you could see Justin Trudeau and Doug Ford have the same approval rating with the same people in Ontario. But in the United States, where, as Donald Trump famously put it when he was running for election, he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and still get support from the people who support him, there wasn't a lot of room to grow. So I think it's a risk, but it's an admirable strategic risk that the Biden campaign has taken in trying to be, to use George W. Bush's phrase, Neera, a uniter, not a divider. I think it's a posture that's going to serve politicians well around the world because people have relatively little time for politics.
Thanks, Jerry. Look, I just like to remind our viewers that if you have a question that you also would like to ask the panel, then you should go to slido.com and use the hashtag Recovery Summit. The team in Ottawa will be collating the kind of questions that come through, and we'll try to make sure that we can get as many of those to the panelists as possible. We've talked a little bit so far in our discussions about how during the COVID crisis, communities came together. Jerry, you just mentioned that the bump in support for leadership that we saw in the early days was a sort of indication of how countries could come together and sort of transcend partisan affiliation and divide. What I'd like to talk a little bit now is about how the global community can come together. I'm going to go to Tim first, but it's striking to me, Tim, that in your presentation you talked about the sort of a demand for multilateralism, but yes, also a protection for broad borders. Now, if we think about this crisis, this economic and public health crisis in comparison to the global financial crisis a decade ago, I mean, I think one of the things that is most striking is just how divided the international community is in some regards. We've not seen the G20 or the G7 come together in the way that we did in the early days of the global financial crisis. I think we possibly all know the reasons for that. Jerry alluded to a growing tension between China and the US. We've obviously got an American president who is not necessarily best fitted towards leading a global response. But I just wonder how you feel we might be able to shape the global politics a little more differently and more constructively than they currently are situated.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's the public sentiment is there, but there's just such an absence of leadership across the world, and that's obviously the consequence of the current environment, and particularly Trump's. And in fact, you know, you've got the competition around vaccines playing out as an example. The effort in the US of Trump, buying out the German firm that was generating one of the possible vaccines sort of early on. I think that the European Commission has been interesting in this respect, because that's the one place where there has been, I think, some dynamic learning along the way. Early on, when Italy was first hit very hard by the crisis, the absence of EU assistance was really palpable. The fact that there were, that's a moment when a regional institution like that just needed to have 1,000 trucks arriving in Italy with the emergency medical equipment, respirators, etc., that were running short. And the absence of that was really strongly felt. And you can see the sort of 20, 25-point drop in support for the EU that has lasted in Italy since that moment. So I think there are particular opportunity moments when international collaboration can be visible and important and make a difference. Clearly some of that, there is a need for leadership as well around the developing world and the needs of countries that have much weaker health systems, because obviously the pandemic has been slower moving in many of those countries. But now when you look at the highest increases in infections and the death rates, is countries like India, for example, but many others that are experiencing increase. So there's the opportunity for difference there. But I think that the absence here, I guess, is the kind of leadership from a number of national leaders outside of Europe. So you've seen it, because essentially that's Merkel and Macron have played a critical role in increasing the EU's engagement now, and the big Rescue Recovery Fund is going to make a difference, and it's going to demonstrate the relevance of European institutions for those national economies. But that's where you're seeing at the moment, right? And without American leadership, it's hard to see how we get that shift. And that's something where I guess, that's why the rest of the world is, hoping for a very particular outcome on November the 3rd.
So can I add something to this?
Absolutely.
Which is, I think we can look at trend lines and try to assess them. But, the global trend lines that Tim talked about, are really actually quite rational when you think about a pandemic. The problem with the pandemic, we're experiencing this in the United States, but a pandemic is hard to control at the state level. It ignores state borders. And ultimately, the real challenge of pandemic is that it will ignore global borders. You cannot have free movement of people and goods and contain a virus. So I think people are actually quite rational about this and think about this in very logical terms. And at the same time, it does make, when a pandemic is raging, it does make sense to close borders, just like it makes sense to close down. So, whether they do the borders in the right way or you're only applying it in the right way, but it actually, I have this conversation in the United States because we similarly see this data, which is that people are as supportive of immigration reform today, in fact, more supportive of immigration reform during comprehensive immigration reform that moves undocumented people to a path to citizenship as they were 4 years ago or ever. It's higher today than it's been in the past. Yet people do want strong borders. And I think the pandemic makes that clear. But I think that's also why I think it's really important that policymakers and political leaders recognize that the pandemic is a kind of altering event in the minds of people. To me, it has the ability to be something along the lines of a Great Depression. And in terms of really altering the consciousness of people. And people recognize that the federal government response and the country's response to a virus directly affects them in the United States, right? So, I think these trend lines make a lot of sense, and we should acknowledge them. And from a global perspective of how to move forward, Biden has offered sharp contrasts on all these issues, sharp contrasts on the vaccine and effective use of the vaccine and a global effort around the vaccine versus just a national approach to the vaccine, supporting the WHO, making sure, even in this moment, making sure that the United States is actually helping the globe deal with the pandemic, not just doing it on ourselves. And I do think the policymakers are thinking through, not policymakers, people in the, Biden campaign and people who are likely to help him govern, thinking through how do we in the pandemic or post-pandemic phase of this, prove out to the American people why strong global governance and strong American leadership makes sense. And it could be, and if there's an administration, if there's a Biden administration, you see a global leadership on the virus in stark contrast to Trump's, which is effective in reducing the spread of the virus around the world in a way that can actually prove out to both the American people and the globe. On one level, the American people can see the role of American leadership actually helping, and in the globe can help restore American leadership as well.
Thanks, Neera. Jerry.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I couldn't tell whether I was unmuted there or not, Matt. I agree with the points that Neera was making for sure. I think that one of the interesting questions, because there is a lot, obviously, that would change with a change in the administration. But one thing that probably won't change, at least in direction, if not in tone, is the transformation of the relationship with China. I think one of the things that I noticed this spring was, or in the late part of the spring, early summer, was the Senate motion to censure China on Hong Kong passed 100-0. Neera, you're a closer attendant to Senate resolutions these days than I am, but I'm not sure anything has passed the Senate 100-0 in recent history. And I think that is going to be particularly challenging for Canada, obviously, how that disaggregation of the US-China trade shakes out. But on the other hand, and this is something we had direct experience with right after the 2015 election because of its proximity to the Paris Agreement and then the final negotiations for the Paris Agreement, the most constructive table for the US and China to talk was on climate change. And of course, given that they're the two largest emitters in the world, there's not any hope of a serviceable agreement coming out of COP26 that doesn't involve both parties. So it's interesting that you've got this push-pull relationship in the international community. There's no question. I mean, I'm a full subscriber to my firm's house view of the G0 world. I think it is a long-term secular trend that was 25 years in the making post Cold War, and it's not going away anytime soon. But at the same time, and again, Neera made this point, it's pretty clear that the institutions we invented in the post-war period needed renovation before we got to this point. And the reason for that is obvious. It's because the world that they were invented to structure and govern doesn't exist anymore. And we're going to have to invent our way out of this problem. And we've done so in the past to great success. There's no reason to believe that we can't do it again. These problems are multilateral in nature, and they're going to require multilateral solutions. For as much negativity and criticism as the Paris process got, and the COP process in general gets, there's nothing that the whole world has agreed to do together other than the Paris Agreement in the past 10 years. So I think that there's cause for optimism, and in particular, maybe one unintended but positive outcome of the COVID crisis is the fact that COP26 was put off for a year. That it's hard to believe that a new Biden administration or an incoming Biden administration would have been able to turn around the aircraft carrier that is the American ship of state in time to come up with a coherent bargaining position. And maybe there's a silver lining in that cloud.
Thanks, Jerry. Now, I'm not sure if you want to come in, but I'd also like to raise an audience question as well. trying to be as inclusive as possible. So we have one here, which is given the likelihood of a disastrous and long post-election transition period in the US, which I think is assuming that Biden has won, what must governments around the world do to prepare people for that chaos?
So I'll take that. Just to Jerry's point earlier, I'll say just 2 words about just a brief sentence about China. I think that Jerry is right that there's a growing consensus about the challenge of China in the United States, and public concern about whether the international system is really fair and whether China has worked that system. But there's a deep difference between how Biden would approach that and how Trump would, which, obviously Trump's approach is unilateral and Biden's approach is actually to think through how you use a multilateral system, how you use allies, how you kind of engage the world in addressing the challenge of China. That's not an easy task, but it's obviously very different. And I think in a way it goes to, in the second point, which is there have been 2 international agreements over the last 10 years that actually had teeth. One was Paris, or had impact, and the other was the Iran deal. And I think that the proponents of the Iran deal are going to be the same people who are thinking through how you use multilateral relationships to affect positive policy in a way that's diffuses problems, not exacerbates them. So I think that China is a concern. It's just not the same kind of concern, or the approach is very different. On the question of the transition, I will say CAP is very focused. Just to share with this audience, Center for American Progress is doing something this fall, which we've never had to do in an election cycle, which is to game out all the ways in which Donald Trump could use processes before, during, and after the election to change the outcome, meaning, ranging from his use of immigration enforcement, essentially federal troops in urban zones, to manipulate. I hope, maybe the story has gone global about the manipulation of the post office, I think we have real challenges with the possibility, a real possible rise in white nationalist violence around the elections. And there are answers to all these problems. There's steps that can be taken. But I would say there's a very high recognition that it is possible that on election night, Trump will look like he's winning the popular vote or winning the electoral college, and will still lose when all votes are counted. And what I would urge governments is to recognize that would not be an accurate sense of who the leader of the United States is. And so I think it is actually really important for governments to wait till votes are counted. And obviously Trump will not want to do that. I assume Russia will acknowledge him immediately, but it is vital for democracies not to acknowledge a leader until one is actually rightfully chosen. Having said that, I also think on other levels that we've been dealing with the press and communicating to them the changed circumstances in order for them not to call the election or influence the election. And there's a lot going on now, which is states are trying to count their mail ballots early. So it kind of lessens the window of the Trump ability to do this. So I think there's a lot of ways that we're all countering these things. But if the question is the precise question is what governments should do, governments should wait until we have an elected, we have a clear result from all the votes coming in, and all the ballots will not be in the country until as late as a week later. So, other countries have experience with this. The United states have experience with this, but the whole country and the world is going, is, in my view, has to recognize that change environment in the United States.
So your answer is sit tight and just wait for every vote to be counted. It's going to be a bumpy road, it sounds.
Yeah, I think that Trump will absolutely, just to spell out our worst fears, I think he's craning, essentially, doing a nod and a wink to like these white nationalist violent groups, because he could use them as essentially shock troops to intimidate mail ballot votes. So, that's full banana republic. That's something that we're all planning around.
Jerry, I saw that you wanted to come in, and also just to transition as well at the end of your response to this to a second question from the audience, which is that, we spent a lot of time at events like this in the past talking about populism, the rise of populism. What's your view on how the populist movement has interacted with the pandemic? Is it more or less relevant, and what should we be looking for as we exit in terms of the return of or a resurgence of populism?
It's a great question. And I think the short answer is that it's different in different countries, but I'll give myself a minute to run the background program in my head about that while I answer the first question. I think Neera is right that discretion is the better part of valor in recognizing the outcome of the election in any national capital. Interestingly, and I'll put in a plug for my own organization here, every year at Eurasia Group, we rank what we think are the top risks to the geopolitical order in January. And this is pre-COVID, or as COVID was becoming part of the nomenclature. And this year, for the first time in the history of the firm, 22 years, we said that the biggest risk on planet Earth was whether or not the US presidential election would be seen as legitimate. It's the first time there's ever been a US domestic politics risk ranked number one in our opinion. And I think the more you dig into this, and most people watching this will realize this, but a lot of more casual observers of politics don't, that US national elections are not really national elections. There are 50 statewide elections, of which about 6 to 8 matter in any given year. And in this year, for my money, the 3 most important states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, have Democratic governors and Republican houses. So you can imagine what's going on day to day to fight over who gets to certify the outcome of the election, and what measures are being taken by both sides to prepare for what is essentially a Florida 2000-like toss-up on election night. I think that with some notable exceptions, I think that the media has done a fairly good job, Neera, of explaining this process to the American public, again, with some notable exceptions. But the sheer number of things that could go wrong makes it, we've taken, our house call is that Biden has a 65% chance of winning the election. But we now put an asterisk beside that because of the sheer number of unique and unprecedented factors at play in the election between now and the time all the votes are counted. On the second question, which I think is a really important one, and I'd appeal back to what I said and what everybody said at the beginning of this panel, I think that right-wing populism preys on people who feel economically disadvantaged and isolated from their communities. And that political philosophy teaches people that the appropriate response to those circumstances is to get angry. And we have to be very careful on the progressive side not to feed into the conditions that create a receptive or fertile ground for that message. I think that there's been some really hopeful signs, notwithstanding the undercurrents that Tim has identified in his excellent research. The AfD is at cyclical lows in Germany. You've seen populist support abate in many countries. On the other hand, Bolsonaro is enjoying his highest approval rating since before COVID. So, it's going to be a challenging environment. And I think it just goes to show you how fluid things are and how important it is to stay really close to what people are enduring in their day-to-day lives.
So I'd like to respond to this as well, if I can, just really briefly, which is to say, I think in the United States, this is really the election is kind of a make or break moment on this question of populism. I mean, I've said this for years. Matt has heard me say it, I'm sure, and probably too much. But if Biden is elected, he has an opportunity. He has opportunities and real challenges. But I consider this moment similar to a 1932 moment in the United States, which is you face a fracturing of politics unless you have a president who can unite the country and solve problems. And if Biden is unsuccessful as president, I think it's possible we will get worse than Trump after 4 years, or likely 4 years if Biden is not successful. And if Biden is successful, I think it is possible that you have a realignment in which already in Trump's base, he's seen some erosion of white non-college women who voted for him 4 years ago, shifting away from him. It is possible you can have a realignment in which at least some group of white non-college voters who formed the base of Trump's support move away from Trump to Democrats, basically around response to the virus. The virus has been one of the reasons why seniors and white non-college women have moved to Biden in the United States. And if he's able to actually address, contain the virus, make a vaccine work for people, have government demonstrate effectiveness, I think he could, shift the kind of paradigm around government. And I'd say the reality is, populism feeds on ineffective countries, right? And in the United States, we essentially had a Republican Party that stifled the ability of Barack Obama to do anything year in, year out for years. I think it gave rise to Trump, and an effective government in the United States can reduce the power of populism, just as I think an effective German government in response to the virus is now you see a waning of populism. And I'm speaking in really broad terms. There's counterexamples sort of everywhere. But I think at a meta level, we have the ability here to actually answer if the reason why people are believing, if young people in different countries are thinking government doesn't work for them, and it's driving them to more extremes, then the answer to that, to me, is to have a government that does work for people, that does prove out that you can actually solve problems and reduce that level of interest in the extremes.
Thanks, Neera. Delivery matters and governance matters. I think that's a very valid point we all agree on. Tim, I'm going to come to you to share a few thoughts on whether we're going to see a resurgence of populism after the pandemic, how the populists have responded to the pandemic. I'd like you to be relatively short because we've only got 2 or 3 minutes left. And I'd like you to end your remark with the sort of one takeaway that you think progressives watching this should hold in their minds as they think about how we build that. And then I'm going to go to Jerry and Neera to ask them about what their one takeaway is for the audience before I close. So Tim, over to you.
Yeah, I think France is quite instructive as a country where there is deep dissatisfaction with the government's response, but that has not translated into increased support for the far right. And they don't feel very relevant there right now. But I think it's wrong to center your analysis in where we are right now. I think that what we have to look to is where is the resentment narrative emerging, and it won't come immediately, right? Like, this is what will emerge over a longer period of time as the economic fallout takes place. Where is that? And I would say it's very connected to people's moral values around fairness, and that a resentment about an unfair outcome. And maybe that'll be if we don't deliver for working people who have been on the front line, and if there's a group or groups that are seen to have benefited, like the contractors, for example, who are making a lot of money out of the COVID contracts. But I think that's the thing to watch, is the resentment narratives. More broadly, just in terms of the larger question of the big takeout, I think in some ways the best takeout is from our work and in this moment is it's really good not to trust your first instincts, your assumptions, because one of the insights around the information environment we're in, liberals, progressives, is it's just really disconnected from the majority of people, their experiences. And so you can think that there's a big sentiment for change when it's much more guarded than that, for example. And I think that having a humility and self-doubt, and not thinking that the way that we see the world is the way that others see or experience the world, is especially important now when there's just like a lot of very specific shifts happening in public perceptions all around the world, because we're in very unique times.
Thanks, Tim. Wise words. Jerry.
Oh, I substantially agree with that. I think that the most important lesson to take from this time is the same as the most important lesson to take from every time in politics, which is to pay very close and detailed attention to where people are and what they want, and deliver policies that help them improve their own lot in life and that of their families and their communities. I think that people are understandably really anxious. I don't think the polls, I think Tim is making a good point, I don't think the polls are particularly reliable in the best of times on top line issues. I think they're really unreliable right now, because one feature of anxiety is that people change their minds quickly and repeatedly. So the lived experience of people and understanding that as deeply as possible is the light of the stars and not the light of every passing ship.
Thanks, Jerry. And Nera. You're on.
First, I want to say thanks for this conversation, because I've learned a lot and it's helped me think through different challenges. I think the thing I would leave is this conversation is really at the end of what I said before, which is, and what you helpfully elucidated, which is, governance and performance really matter and have direct results. And I think people are absolutely not living their lives through politics. I think in the United States, that's a bit different because everything has been consumed by politics. And I think actually a lot of people would like to go back to not thinking about politics all the time. But most, I think we have the ability to, if you think of two global trends here through the coronavirus, we have the ability to, realize the progressive goal of making government truly work for people. People are more open to government, and that is a government action than they've ever been. On the other hand, we have real trends of social media, created by social media, of deep chasms of distrust, which I think are very undermining of democracy and collective action. And whether we can, move through those hurdles to actually realize progressive gains is, I think, a central challenge for the next year, unless we're in a second Trump term, and then all bets are off.
Well, that's a sobering thought to end on. But Nera, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. I know there's a lot going on in progressive politics in the US, and our thoughts and best wishes are with you, obviously, over the next 50 days. Jerry, Tim, thank you also for joining us, and thank you to viewers for taking time to join us in this conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I think it's been a great way to start off this summit. Can I remind those of you who are watching that in just under 10 minutes at 11 Eastern, we will be starting the Global Public Health panel. That'll be chaired by Dr. James Orbinski, and will also be joined at the top with a very special message from the Director General of the World Health Organization. So once again, thank you all to the panelists, and thank you to you, the viewers, for joining us. I look forward to carrying this conversation on very soon. Bye-bye.
Today, we are facing an unprecedented health crisis that doesn't come with easy answers. But discovering the first infant meningitis vaccine wasn't simple either. And identifying early onset Alzheimer's genes was no walk in the park. There are easier problems to tackle. Problems that don't take countless hours in countless labs. Collaborating across organizations and creating new partnerships with government, life sciences organizations, and educational institutions. Isolating thousands of compounds for potential new medicines. Not seeing the result of your work for years. Maybe a decade. Maybe longer. Easy is nice, but easy doesn't change the world. And when stakes are life and death, we reject easy. We choose the hard way instead, entering uncharted territory in search of the next medicine, next treatment, next vaccine that will solve health issues that have been around a long time, and working steadfast on the urgent crises of today that require immediate action to bring relief and make life better for Canadians. There's no guarantee of success, just hope and a lot of hard work. Because the only thing harder than the hard way is not doing anything.
Hello, my name is Dr. James Orbinski, and I'm honored to be a Summit co-chair. And I'm also honored to focus on global public health for the Recovery Summit. Thank you to Canada 2020 and to Global Progress for putting together this event. I'm the director of the Dadala Institute for Global Health Research at York University. The Recovery Summit is a lead up to the UN General Assembly meetings next week, where COVID will very obviously feature prominently. The Recovery Summit is really an opportunity for progressive governments, business, academic, NGO, and philanthropic leaders to discuss the central pillars of a global recovery effort. This is a COVID recovery summit, but I must point out that the pandemic is far from over. The United Nations Secretary General has rightly called the COVID pandemic the greatest global crisis since the founding of the United Nations. Hundreds of millions of people around the world have been affected. There has been a $30 trillion reduction in global economic output. That is the projection to year end. $11 trillion has been mobilized by the G7 and other OECD countries to support their domestic populations and societies. We've also, at the same time, however, seen unprecedented scientific collaboration. Since the COVID genome was characterized only a few short months ago, we now have over 170 different vaccine candidates with 35 ongoing clinical trials. We also have more than 400 different clinical trials underway for new treatments for COVID. We've seen new diagnostics. We've seen a digital technological revolution around contact tracing, for example. And yet, the pandemic is far from over. We need more collaboration. 29 million people are dead. 29 million people have been infected. 900,000 and more growing every day are dead. And we are already well into the second wave of the pandemic. And this will only be exacerbated as we enter now the coming flu season. And we're reminded that the Spanish flu of 1917 and 1918, which took somewhere between 50 and 75 million lives, killed more people in the second and third waves than it did in the first. And here we are today, September 14, 2020, and we still, despite unprecedented scientific collaboration, we still have no vaccine. We have no definitive treatment. The nature of human immunity to the COVID virus is still being characterized. Mutation of the virus, the probability of mutation of the virus is 100% certain. What is uncertain is the nature of that mutation and what pattern of morbidity and mortality will be associated with that mutation. Yes, the crisis is ongoing. But why is the idea of recovery vital to consider now? Well, because how we respond now is critically important to 5 core ideas that are central to this summit: shared prosperity, democratic institutions, sustainability, and inclusive societies. And central to each of these is global public health. Never before has the world experienced a pandemic of such widespread, global, destructive social and economic impact. And despite some successes, I have to say, the collaborative response to the COVID pandemic is mitigated and colossal failure. COVID demonstrates unequivocally that, in the words of Martin Luther King, we live in an inescapable network of mutuality. And where we have recognized this around COVID, we have succeeded in containing, controlling, and mitigating the spread of the virus. And where we continue to recognize this, we will succeed. But where we have not recognized this, we have failed, and we will continue to fail. It is absolutely clear that market prosperity depends on society, and societies, to be secure, depend on human security. Thus far, we have failed to support our most vulnerable. OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, has made a $10 billion special appeal for humanitarian relief. That appeal is only 22% funded. And while we have acknowledged the need for ongoing scientific collaboration, to date, we have failed to fund the most viable collaborative platform that exists now today, the WHO ACT platform. This is only about 10% funded. It needs $35 billion, $15 billion in the next 3 months, and most especially to support its COVAX initiative, and most especially to support efforts to create new drugs and new diagnostics. And equally importantly, we have failed to engage and to support pandemic preparedness. Recovery means that we must prioritize equity, sustainability, and resilience in a social and economic roadmap to recovery. During the next few minutes and over the next hour and a half or so, we will focus on the humanitarian impacts, the future of pandemic preparedness, and a roadmap to social and economic recovery. These are core ideas and core concepts that are relevant to global public health, and they're core to a genuine and effective and equitable recovery. We have a stellar group of speakers and panelists to explore the centrality of global public health to recovery. There is, however, no one better in the world to speak to the global impact of the COVID pandemic than Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the World Health Organization. Dr. Tedros has been dedicated since the beginning of the pandemic to defining the crisis, to shaping the response, and charting the core elements to the road to recovery. To begin the summit, we now have a special address from Dr. Tedros. Thank you.
Dr. Orbinski, dear friends and colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you today on this very important topic, our collective recovery from COVID-19. Global public health is one of 5 key themes for the recovery project, the others being shared prosperity, democratic resilience, sustainability, and inclusive societies. In fact, I would argue that health is central to all of them. The pandemic has demonstrated the intimate connections between health and every area of our lives, societies, and economies. COVID-19 is the most severe public health crisis in a century, with more than 27 million reported cases and 880,000 deaths. Lives and livelihoods have been lost. The social, economic, and political impacts of the pandemic will be far-reaching and long-lasting. I want to start by expressing my sincere condolences to the families of those who have died in Canada and around the world. One place where Canada has shown leadership, both historically and in the face of COVID-19, is speaking out in support of collective, cooperative action. As a nation of multilateralists and a country that relies upon and contributes to international cooperation, Canada can make a real difference in the weeks and months to come. Since the very beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, I have stressed the need for global solidarity, national unity, political leadership based on science and evidence, and engaging communities to build trust. Those same features are essential not only for ending the pandemic, but also for our collective recovery. We're all eagerly anticipating the arrival of safe and effective vaccines for COVID-19. But once we have an effective vaccine, we must also use it effectively and equitably. We cannot permit access to vaccines to become a contest that only the rich and powerful can win. The COVAX facility, led by the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, Innovations, Gavi, the Vaccines Alliance, and WHO, is the agreed international mechanism ensuring equitable access to vaccines. More than 170 countries, including Canada, have expressed interest in joining the COVAX facility. But we do not have to wait for a vaccine to turn the tide on this pandemic. Many countries have shown that with the right mix of measures, this virus can be controlled. WHO is urging countries to focus on 4 priorities for a safe reopening of societies, economies, and borders. First, prevent amplifying events through a risk-based local approach. In some places, this might mean suspending mass gatherings. In others, it might mean limiting them or finding creative ways to hold them safely. Second, reduce deaths by protecting essential workers and the most vulnerable groups, including older people and those with underlying conditions. Third, empower and educate individuals and communities to protect themselves and others by using physical distancing, hand hygiene, respiratory etiquette, and masks, not in isolation, but together. And fourth, focus on the public health basics. Find, isolate, test, and care for cases, and trace and quarantine their contacts. COVID-19 has taken so much from us, but it has also given us something, the opportunity to rebuild a world that is more inclusive, more sustainable, and more resilient. The pandemic is a test of science and technology, but it's also a test of character, a test of whether the world can come together in solidarity when it matters most against a common threat. This virus thrives on division, but united, we can defeat it. Together, we must all call on our leaders to unite to end the pandemic and to build the healthier, safer, fairer world we all want. I thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tedros, for your leadership over the last few months and for your inspiring message. We're going now to a series of presentations. One will follow the other from 4 outstanding global health leaders who have been dedicated to the response and recovery efforts for the pandemic. In just a moment, you will hear from Dr. Jane Philpott, the former Canadian Minister of Health and now Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences at Queen's University. Then you will hear from Dr. Ellen Bernstein, the President and Chief Executive Officer of CFAR. And then you'll hear from Dr. Sam Nutt, the founder of War Child Canada and War Child USA. And then finally, you will hear from Dr. Ramesh Rajasingham, who's the Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator at the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. I will then return to begin moderating the panel on global public health. Thank you. Dr. Jane Philpott.
Hi, my name is Jane Philpott, and I am the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences here at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And I'm very pleased to be speaking to the Recovery Project on the topic of global public health, and specifically on the issue of our humanitarian crisis and the humanitarian response to COVID-19. If I were to give this short talk any title, I'd call it Raising Our Eyes. Why would I speak about that? Well, I think for a very long time, as the pandemic has unfolded, we've been looking down. We've been looking at what we can see around us. It's pretty easy to do that when you're in the midst of a pandemic and everywhere you look, there's a crisis. But from a global perspective, it's time to look up. It's time to challenge one another to raise our eyes, to look farther to the future, and to look farther around us than those who are immediately affected and who immediately come to mind. This is a humanitarian crisis, and this is a time to look at the broad impacts of COVID-19. Why should we raise our eyes, and how are we going to do it? Well, I'd like to offer a few ways. Number one, from a geographic perspective. We need to look well beyond our own borders. The virus, like any infectious disease, doesn't respect borders. And we know, in this case, as always, that what affects one of us directly affects everyone indirectly. And we've certainly seen that demonstrated in COVID-19. The second way that I think we need to raise our eyes is to look at the matter of cultural humility. It turns out there have been some surprises about the COVID-19 pandemic. We wouldn't have guessed exactly who did well and who didn't, what countries did well, what regions. And we've seen that it's not always the places with the most resources that have done the best. we've had to learn that actually there are a number of cultural factors why some groups do better than others. Here in Canada, I've spoken with many First Nations leaders who have been remarkably effective at protecting their communities. They've protected their elders because their culture has been based on looking to the needs of the elders, delivering food, making sure that the most vulnerable in their communities are cared for. And in fact, the impact of COVID-19 has been remarkably lessened because of those incredible lessons that they have demonstrated to the rest of us. The third area is with regard to institutional structures. And here's a topic that I know is important in the recovery project. What are the global institutional structures that we have to look to and support? The World Health Organization is obviously the one that comes immediately to mind for many of us, to look to how we can actually support and resource global institutions like the WHO to be able to provide the role that we need them to in order to protect one another. The final area that I'd like to talk about is the non-COVID harms. And this is an area that I know is also important in this global health segment. There's plenty of data already about the excess mortality that's taken place because we have moved health system structures to focus to COVID, sometimes to the detriment of other infectious diseases, not to mention the non-communicable diseases. Here in Canada, one of the issues that we've faced in a significant way is people with very serious mental health crises, higher rates of suicide, higher rates of problematic substance use as a result of the measures that have been taken to lessen the impact of COVID-19. So I'll leave that with you. I look forward to hearing the response of the panel. But let's raise our eyes and let's look beyond ourselves.
Hello, everybody. My name is Alan Bernstein. I'm the president and CEO of CFAR. Today, I'd like to talk to you about developing a vaccine against COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2. This will be a talk of three. The first three will be the three different approaches, scientific approaches that are being used to develop this vaccine. First approach is a sort of new technology, RNA vaccines. The second one is recombinant vectors, typically an adenovirus vector or a missile that delivers the gene for, in this case, a spike protein into our body. And the third is using protein subunits, purified proteins. Again, this little spike knob that sticks out of the outside of the coronavirus that's responsible for COVID-19. All three platforms have been developed very quickly over the last few years, and all have entered into clinical trials. The second group of three are clinical trials. There are three stages to a clinical trials, 1, 2, and 3. Stage 1 is really meant to see whether the vaccine is doing two things. Is it causing any adverse events in a small number of people? We don't want to expose thousands of people to this vaccine candidate if it's really causing problems. Small number of people. And does it elicit on the side highly neutralizing antibodies or other kind of immune responses against the virus as a bonus at this point? If it doesn't cause any adverse events in a small number of people, it goes on to phases 2 and 3. Phase 3 involves a lot of people, 30 to 60,000 people divided by age groups, by gender, by ethnicity, and a placebo group to see whether the vaccine is safe and effective. And that safe and effective is not determined by the company, it's determined by an independent group, and it's also ultimately determined by the regulator. Here in Canada, the regulator is Health Canada. My third or second set of threes is the ingredients that have gone into making this sort of vaccine race against the virus so effective. I think the first part of this has been the amazing amount of global collaboration and coordination that's going on within the scientific community, between scientists and the biopharmaceutical industry, government, and regulators. And of course, the volunteers who are holding out their arms to be vaccinated in these trials. I think this has been so critical, and that's one reason all of this has gone ahead so fast. The second ingredient in all this has been the power of science. Everything that's going on in this whole pandemic, from the PCR tests for diagnostics, the antibody tests that are being developed, vaccines and drugs, all of this has come out of really powerful fundamental science over the last few years. The last thing I want to talk about is vaccine nationalism. I think it's natural for every country to want to make sure that they vaccinate their own citizens first, and then if there's vaccine left over or money left over, to vaccinate others. And I understand that. But one thing we should keep in mind, front of mind, is this is like a forest fire. If the virus is anywhere, it's everywhere. And so it's in our own selfish self-interest, not only to vaccinate as many Canadians as we can, but also to vaccinate enough people everywhere. Because if there's still a pandemic going on in Africa, for example, it will eventually make its way back to Canada. Because remember, this whole thing started with the virus infecting a single individual in Wuhan, China. And so it's in our interest, as I said, to make sure we vaccinate everybody and to contribute to the multilateral facilities that have been developed. You'll hear the word COVAX, the COVAX facility, to buy vaccines for everybody on the planet, not just for our own country. So in closing, I'd just like to stress that this is, I think, a really amazing opportunity for us to think back when this pandemic is over, of how did we deal with this so quickly? And it seems like forever, I know that. But if we can eliminate this pandemic and this virus within a year or so, that's a world record. And we did it because of science, because of global collaboration and coordination, and because of looking after each other. And we should remember those three lessons as we think about other challenges facing the planet. Malaria, TB, HIV have not gone away. Sleeping sickness has not gone away. Climate change has not gone away. Income inequality has not gone away. These are issues that we can also tackle once we've dealt with COVID-19. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Samantha Nutt, founder and president of Warchild Canada and USA. I'm also a staff physician at Women's College Hospital and an assistant professor of medicine at the University of Toronto. I know that sounds like a mouthful, but if I were to sum up what I do, I have spent more than 2 decades working to advance and promote the health and well-being of women and children living with war and poverty throughout the world. The pandemic of COVID-19 has presented unprecedented challenges to all of us, no matter where we live. But it has had an even more profound and devastating impact on communities already wrestling with trauma, violence, poverty, inequality, and a lack of access to basic health care. Nowhere in the world are these challenges, these ongoing threats to human lives, more acute than in the world's war zones and refugee camps. COVID-19 has only deepened these threats as aid dollars get redirected to fighting the pandemic, and services they desperately need are disrupted or cease altogether. On top of this, the threats to the economy and employment caused by COVID-19 mean that more people, especially women, in communities in which education and basic income were already hard to access, are becoming even more vulnerable. So what can and should be done in the months and years ahead to ensure communities wrestling with war and poverty have not only the best chance to withstand the pandemic, but even possibly realize a more permanent recovery, one which would advance and sustain global health for generations? To me, and this is my pitch, it means increasing global investments in education with a focus on the most vulnerable and those for whom education is difficult, if not impossible, to access. And that doesn't seem like the kind of thing a public health doctor might say, but education is the cornerstone of global health and offers the best hope for building back better in the wake of COVID-19. Education everywhere in the world has been one of the biggest casualties of this pandemic. Hundreds of millions of children, at least 463 million of them, according to UNICEF, representing 1/3 of school children worldwide. Those children were forced to abandon school altogether because they could not access remote learning programs when their schools closed. And that's if those programs were even available in the first instance. And those hundreds of millions of children are added to the more than 250 million primary and secondary school age children who were out of school prior to the current pandemic. The vast majority of these children are in low-income countries, and a lack of access to schooling is especially pronounced in countries in which War Child is working throughout the world. And yet, the evidence for education as critical to advancing and promoting global health is irrefutable. A systematic analysis spanning 30 years of demographic data and 175 countries confirms that education is directly correlated with improved health outcomes and significant reductions in child mortality. In fact, on average, for every additional year of education girls in particular attain within a community, child mortality drops by almost 10%. The pandemic has forced governments and educators throughout the world to reconsider how education is delivered and accessed, and how to ensure that that access is consistent and that education is high quality, particularly for children living with poverty and in areas that have limited supports or infrastructure. These challenges are compounded by the violence and insecurity common to the world's war zones, where many children cannot leave their homes or walk safely to school, even if one existed, because of the threat of injury, abduction, and sexual violence. A few years ago, War Child Canada launched a distance-based learning program in conjunction with local community groups and local government to deliver high-quality educational programming using the basic technology of radio in hard-to-access communities in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Tied to the national curriculum and recorded with the support of local educators and personalities, learners from 12 to 19 years of age listened to 90-minute broadcasts during the school week. 93% of those participants, after 2 years, all of whom were previously out of school, passed their national exams. In the wake of COVID-19 and in partnership with Education Can't Wait, the Congolese government, and the Government of Canada, this model has now been expanded to almost 1 million Congolese children, children who would not otherwise access education because of the barriers created by poverty, conflict, and now the pandemic. The tools that are available to ensure children have access to quality education, even in the most complex environments, don't have to be technologically advanced, and they don't have to be expensive. Radio is a basic tool available in most communities, and unlike a personal computer or tablet, there really is no limit to how many students can listen to a broadcast at once. With support, and if the material is well designed and engaging, those students can get there. We all hope that someday soon the pandemic will be behind us and our lives can return to normal. For children growing up in war zones, however, there is no normal. The end of the pandemic won't signal an end to the violence and inequality so many of them have confronted their entire lives. Education is critical to disrupting that cycle and supporting their health and well-being. The pandemic has taught us many things about ourselves, our countries, our governments, and our communities. It has also exposed our hypocrisies, complacencies, and frailties. Let us learn from these experiences to ensure that the youngest generations, no matter where they are in the world, can live full, healthy lives. This is how we build back better. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and the Recovery Project for this opportunity. I appreciate your efforts to showcase the need to help the most vulnerable people living in low-income and fragile countries to recover from this pandemic. We're all grappling with this. In low-income countries, it has caused an acute health crisis and an even more devastating economic, human, and social crisis. As of today, more than 27 million cases of the disease have been recorded worldwide. It has claimed more than 900,000 lives and affected millions of people. About a third of global COVID-19 cases and fatalities are in extremely vulnerable countries or in countries already dealing with humanitarian or refugee crises. In many of these places, the indirect impact of the virus has been catastrophic. The economic crisis caused by global and domestic virus protection measures has left millions of daily wage earners, many of them women, without an income. We've seen horrifying increases in the violence against women. Children and older people have also become more exposed to abuse. Our analysis in 32 low-income countries shows that pandemics could push between 71 million and 100 million people into extreme poverty if urgent action is not taken by the international community. Since we are discussing public health at this session, I would like to underline that one of the biggest effects of this pandemic has been on the continuity of essential health services. Healthcare facilities are overwhelmed in low-income countries. Healthcare workers lack personal protective equipment, and people, including many women, cannot access services or choose not to as they fear contagion. In many situations, health budgets are not being funded. Immunization campaigns are being disrupted or delayed, and lockdowns have reduced the availability of vaccines, drugs, and other vital health supplies. This is happening in places where people are already extremely vulnerable to killer diseases like measles, malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS. Many of these countries are home to huge numbers of extremely vulnerable people, such as refugees, migrants, and displaced. Disruptions to immunization alone could put more than 18 million children under the age of 1 at risk of vaccine-preventable diseases. To help these countries, the UN Secretary General launched the COVID-19 Global Humanitarian Response Plan in March of this year. The plan has been updated as the crisis deepened. It now seeks $10 billion over the next 6 months to help 250 million people in 63 countries. Since March, we have raised little more than 23% of what we urgently need. It's not enough. Thanks to funding provided by some donors, we have achieved a huge amount nevertheless, including delivering personal protective equipment to 730,000 health workers, including masks, gloves, and gowns, given information on the virus on how to protect yourself to more than 1 billion people in nearly 60 countries, and getting soap and detergent and improved water and sanitation systems to tens of millions of people. However, fragile countries do not have the kind of resources that rich countries have at their disposal. The OECD and G20 countries have put more than $11 trillion to help keep families and businesses afloat in their countries. In comparison, the cost of protecting 10% of the world's most vulnerable from COVID-19 today is an additional 90 billion, less than 1% of the stimulus package. Of the 143 billion provided by international financial institutions to counter the pandemic's impact so far, only 7% has been committed to low-income countries. That represents 1/5 of what the better-off countries have done at home. We have not fared any better in our efforts to raise funds for humanitarian action. The inadequate response of wealthy nations to the GHRP is short-sighted. Our analysis shows that an unmitigated COVID-19 outbreak in low-income countries could lead to a second wave of infections this year, which would result in an additional loss of $1.1 trillion in OECD countries. Beyond the economic impact of the crisis, there is a looming human tragedy. If left unmitigated, COVID-19 could infect up to 640 million people and kill 1.67 people of the world's most vulnerable populations in 32 low-income countries. At least 2 million preventable deaths could occur due to healthcare disruptions. I urge rich countries to persuade international financial institutions to provide more funds to low-income countries. The unavoidable truth is that no one is safe on this globe until every one of us is safe. Again, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you to our 4 guests for preparing their presentations, which, as well as Dr. Tedros's address, really do set the stage for our panel discussion on global public health. I'm hoping in this panel that we will really focus around 3 big issues. One is the humanitarian impacts of COVID-19. The second is a research roadmap that incorporates social and economic development in the path to recovery. And the third is the vital importance of appropriate pandemic preparedness for the future. We have 3 outstanding global leaders to address these issues. Welcome to each of you. and thank you for being here today. Absolutely delighted that you've been able to find the time to join us. Now, many of our prior speakers have emphasized the humanitarian issues associated with COVID-19. And Dr. Christos Christou is the international president of Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders. He's also a consultant surgeon who has many, many years of field experience working in war, in famine, in situations of epidemic disease, and only 1 year ago took on the role of international president of MSF, which, as many will know, is the world's largest independent medical humanitarian organization. Welcome, Christos. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me begin by asking you, Christos, what do you see, given the discussions that we've had through our presentations, what do you see as the core humanitarian issues today?
Thank you, James, and thanks for this opportunity to communicate a few of the key messages that we would like to share with everyone. And in order to answer your question, I think first we have very briefly to go through what we have been confronted with the last few months. And the key priorities for us all these previous 6 months were how to protect the healthcare workers everywhere amid the global shortages of PPEs, how to maintain our ongoing operations wherever possible, while having at the same time to repurpose and reposition our work by launching emergency interventions in support of populations having COVID-19 in several new places all over the world. And last but not least at all, how to mobilize our resources, our humanitarian workers and our supplies when the whole planet was in strict lockdown. 6 months later, and while we still face plenty of these challenges, it's time to look back and look up, as Dr. Philpott said, to raise our eyes. And based on our experience as an international humanitarian organization, being always constantly on the front line, I will attempt to summarize our key messages and answer your question. Message number one, there are collateral disasters or several crises within this crisis. This pandemic overshadowed every other health topic, but the need for regular medical care does not disappear just because COVID has arrived. Babies will still be born, vaccines will still be required, the need for life-saving treatment will not disappear, victims of wars and malnourished kids will still need our help. The number of people experiencing potentially life-threatening food insecurity in the developing world is expected to nearly double this year. And with the statistics on domestic violence rocketing in many countries, sexually and gender-based violence service, safe abortion care, and mental health will be even more important. So mental health issues are also alerting a lot. So we must therefore strive to see the bigger picture when it comes to COVID-19 and maintain our commitment to humanity beyond borders or any national boundaries. The second point is we need to ensure that everyone will have access to safe, effective, and affordable diagnostics and medicines as well, not just vaccines. And as the first COVID-19 vaccine will most probably not be the best one, it is crucial that we do not leave the development of better tests and drugs behind. The third point is when it comes to the COVID vaccine itself, and has been already mentioned, after the momentum with the launching of the ACT Accelerator in April, we got disappointed as MSF to watch that each state played an individual card and almost no one speaks anymore of the common good. So solidarity was quickly replaced by selfishness, and the solidarity pot became a charity basket. And last point, COVID became a magnifying glass of what we in MSF are daily confronted with: social violence. All those large-scale social forces, racism, gender inequality, poverty, political violence, and war, which very often determine who falls ill and who has access to care. So for us, indigenous populations, people on the move, homeless, prison detainees, elder people in nursing homes are the marginalized majority who should not be neglected or excluded. So while we try to look ahead and see what the recovery should look like, I have two things to share. The one is invest more in public health systems, which have been systematically underfunded the last years, even in the most well-developed countries. So we need to reinforce and rethink of public health, we need to relaunch this concept of biosocial understandings of the medical phenomena and find ways to look at the nature of the diseases through multiple lenses: biological, medical, social, environmental. And we need to remember in this that a patient-centered approach is not enough. We need community engagement, which is very crucial. And these are our lessons that we learned also from other outbreaks, with the most recent one, the Ebola. I will stop here because we will have time to elaborate later, but we should not neglect the humanitarian needs of those most neglected populations, but instead support them by investing more. And this is the only way that we can propose international solidarity against all those narrow, macro-political and egoistic approaches. Thank you very much.
Well, Christos, that's a great overview, and it's also a great segue to Dr. Stephen Hoffman. Stephen is a friend and colleague. He's also the lead or chair, if you will, of the UN Research Roadmap for COVID-19 recovery. He's also scientific director of the Canadian Institute for Population Health, and he's director of the Global Strategy Lab at York University. Stephen, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today. Stephen, how would you define, given the framing that Christos has given us of humanitarian needs in the immediate moment, how would you define your role now and the vision, if you will, of the UN Research Roadmap for COVID-19 recovery? My understanding, Stephen, is that it's really focused on exactly what Christos has emphasized in his last point, which is really the social and the economic structures and systems and processes that are in place or not in place that need to somehow be reconfigured so that we have a much more fair, just, and equitable recovery. How would you then, given what I've just said, how would you frame what the recovery map is about?
Great. First, James, big thank you for the invitation to be here and the Recovery Project for this opportunity. The UN Research Roadmap for the COVID-19 recovery will ultimately be about making sure that we don't only build back from COVID-19, but that we actually can recover better. In that respect, we know that there's going to be lots of changes, and indeed already so many changes around the world. This has been one of the most destabilizing events for people around the world. But we also know that this is then an opportunity to get us onto a better trajectory in order to accelerate progress for all the things that we want to achieve, including and especially the Sustainable Development Goals. And so from that perspective, of course, when we think of a pandemic like COVID-19, our immediate focus is on, for example, getting therapeutics, getting a vaccine developed, effective diagnostics, ensuring they're effective and equitably distributed. But at the same time, as Dr. Philpott mentioned, we have to keep our eyes raised, and we have to raise our eyes towards that future that we want to build. And so that means that even in the midst of a pandemic, we actually need to be thinking about now, how can we build back better, more equitably, more resiliently, more sustainably, so that we have that better future. And the key, though, is that as much as, of course, this rebuilding will require extensive political will and action, we need to make sure that that action is informed by the best available research evidence that exists, but also new research that needs to be generated to inform these very important questions going forward. And so that's what the UN Research Roadmap for the COVID-19 recovery is all about. It's all about ensuring that we can leverage the power of science in order to make sure not only that we build back, but actually build back better for the future.
So, Stephen, thanks for that. And it's also, like Christos's segue to you, it's also a great segue to Iona, our next panelist. Iona Kickbush is the founder and chair of the Global Health, of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva. And she's also a board member of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. Iona, in the inaugural report last year of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, it noted very clearly and very, very strongly that the systems that we have in place for pandemic preparedness are egregiously inadequate in terms of their functionality, but also in terms of the financing that's required to detect and respond to health emergencies. It also noted that as COVID-19 has proven, these systems are egregiously and dangerously deficient. We've seen major cutbacks in funding to the WHO over the last couple of years. We've even seen, for example, the Trump administration withdraw support for the WHO in the last months. We've seen nations like Canada actually reduce their funding to global pandemic preparedness programs that are domestically based, but that interdigitate with the WHO system. So from your perspective as a board member of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, what would you say are the core challenges today in terms of pandemic preparedness for future pandemics? You're on mute, Iona, sorry.
Sorry. Thank you very much, James, for asking me to join this group, particularly because today we launched our second report from the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, and its title is A World in Disorder. And that disorder, of course, relates to the big geopolitical challenges we have right now, and you alluded to it. And it's one of the big problems that this pandemic has hit us in the midst of a big geopolitical divide and standoff. And that has many consequences that you've alluded to, including financial consequences, including a decrease in support to multilateralism, particularly through the Trump administration, and of course, a whole range of financing issues that flow from that. We've done an analysis that actually indicated 5 big areas where we need to get better. And you know, in our area, we can't say build back better because the system has been so weak, has been so badly financed, has had so little political support that we can't use any of these slogans. In our own work, there has been this other slogan of, you know, the cycle of panic and neglect. And if anything, you know, that describes it better. The 5 areas that you would find in the report are, first of all, of course, the responsible leadership, and many of the political leadership issues I've just sort of hinted at, we might get at that more afterwards, are related to that. But it also means leadership in terms not only of narrowly understood health security, but what we have seen, and one of the new slogans we use in our report, is that there can be no health security without social security. And our leaders need to realize that we cannot increase social divides. And we also have to be aware of new types of social divides. I'm thinking of the racial divides we have experienced in many of the developed countries, which have been a true tragedy and a scandal, if we can say that. We've spoken in our report about engaged citizenship. Some of my colleagues referred to that, but also we've tried to make the point it's not just the state or others or public health systems that need to look after us. We as citizens need to look after each other. And a solidarity of citizens, if we speak also of social security within communities. And, you know, we in our developed countries thought that the community lessons we learned from Ebola, I think Christos related to that they don't apply to us. We thought we were immune. We thought, you know, our communities were just there. We didn't understand what we could learn from Ebola. We, of course, in our report also relate to, and it's been mentioned, to the national and global systems that we need, also linked to The fourth point of investment in preparedness, that of course includes public health systems. If I think of my own country, Germany, it has just announced 4 billion euro investment in public health. Now, I think that's wonderful, but I wish that had been 5 or 10 years ago. Thank you very much. Because I, having been on many of the panels that were established after Ebola, I can only tell you my sense of déjà vu is extraordinary and very, very, very discouraging. Just two last points that obviously we refer to, and we will get back to them, is that a number of the international instruments that we have are totally insufficient. We have learned that the IHR is not fit for purpose. We have clearly seen that the ODA financing system is not fit for purpose for pandemic preparedness. We've been talking millions, we need billions, if in some cases not trillions. And I think we need to look at that. We did a calculation based on some other work that we need an investment per annum of $5 per head to be able to actually move ahead. So what we've called for is a new framework for health security, which obviously includes primary health care and universal health coverage. And we've called on the UN Secretary General and the heads of international financing institutions to convene a UN summit on global health security, where these issues are taken up seriously. No building back, it's only building forward, and it's enormous political commitment that we need.
When I listen, thank you, Iona, just a very succinct and clear summary. When I listen to the three of you, it strikes me that we're really at a critical juncture in terms of how we think about multilateralism and its effectiveness. I don't think there's really any question to any of us here on this panel how absolutely vitally important multilateralism and multilateral institutions are. And I don't think, for all of our sometimes public criticisms of UN agencies, I don't think any of us on this panel would take a position that the UN is irrelevant and that it is unnecessary and so on. It's absolutely vital. It's never has it been more necessary since its founding in 1945, and yet functionally, as COVID demonstrates, never has it been more marginalized. In terms of funding, in terms of political mechanisms, in terms of political process. That said, one of the things that each of you have touched on in various ways is the importance of community and the importance of citizen engagement, the importance, Stephen, of social and economic systems and structures that allow for mutuality between peoples in their communities and across nations. And Christos, you've very briefly alluded to the importance of supporting community in the response to COVID. Christos, do you want to just touch on that for a moment?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. It's not just supporting the community, but from the lessons that we've learned, and especially I was referring to Ebola, is that we may be missing the true intervention and how to set it up if we don't engage and if we don't involve the community. It's about co-owning and co-designing the treatment strategies. And I don't know if I have to elaborate more on why is this important, but we've been experimenting several years now on putting the patient on the center of what we do. And we realize that even if we look at the needs of the patients and not the needs of the disease, if we treat the patients based on their needs without just addressing a public health issue or a problem like a disease, it is still not enough. Because we need to do it within a specific frame. And that's where the whole community comes that can accelerate and also multiply the outcome, the effect, the impact that we will have. And we've noticed also now with the COVID that in many communities, when there was this brilliant collaboration, we overcame the serious barriers and problems that are related to both misinformation, disinformation, and how to better approach those most in need and those most neglected.
Iona, you wanted to jump in a moment ago. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in and take issue a little bit with what you said about the marginalization, because I think it also depends on context and where you look from. Because it seems to me, obviously, we know that the Trump administration has put WHO to one side. And it's interesting if we read the new Woodward book on what weak arguments that was done. You mentioned that Canada had also pulled back, etc. What we've seen during the COVID-19 crises is actually a number of European countries and the European Union doing quite the opposite, and saying we need to build and support multilateralism. Germany and France have created an alliance for multilateralism, which also looks at global health. Canada has actually joined that. And Germany and France have put forward a reform proposal for the World Health Organization. The European Union and some other European member states have put forward significant funding for the World Health Organization to partly balance what the Trump administration might pull out of the organization. We'll see what happens in November. So I think in an interesting way, a new dynamics has started. Some of us have said for a long time, Europe needs to be more active. We don't like the word leadership. You know, I keep reading these things about the US is losing leadership and the UK is saying we should take leadership. We want to act in partnership and in solidarity with one another. And we're grappling with things. I think Steve alluded to it and some of the other speakers earlier. You know, you can't just in 3 months create a solidaric structure like COVAX. You have to work at it. You have to build new legal rules. You actually will need new IP rules in the World Trade Organization. You'll need all kinds of things. But at least, and I'm not trying to be overly optimistic or anything, but at least there are a group of countries and one regional body and partly the African Union as well, who are saying, we want to move forward here. We no longer also want a UN system that's led by the United States. We want our voice, and particularly the countries of the South are saying that, and we should listen to them.
Well, I think you've really touched on a crucially important point for this recovery summit, and particularly for the deliberations that people are engaging in advance of the General Assembly meetings next week. Partnership. Partnership is the key to supporting a viable multilateralism. And I think, you know, when the Trump administration did withdraw from the WHO, we saw immediately Ireland, Europe, the continental Europe, even Canada and many nations from the global South immediately step up and within their means offer support and political support and financial support for the WHO. So I think on the one hand, what I've said is true. You know, the old way of doing things is no more. And we have now this emergent way, this emergent approach, which in fact, I believe is truly hopeful in terms of our ability to respond to the COVID pandemic, and also in terms of our ability to generate a more viable and effective global public health. Stephen, within that context, just give us a thumbnail of what you think are the priority issues around social and economic development in terms of a research roadmap for the UN. How can that contribute to a more viable and effective global public health?
Well, it's clear there's lots of research needs at this time in order to build back towards a better, more equitable, resilient, sustainable future. I think that's the key, in the sense that we know there's going to be lots of changes. There's going to be lots of recovery efforts already happening. So the key is we need new knowledge to figure out how can we make sure that the recovery efforts that we do are not just achieving direct benefits for what they're trying to do, but also at the same time, simultaneously produce co-benefits for equity, resilience, and sustainability. We need a kind of quadruple bottom line, right? When we're coming to these efforts, it's not enough to have a single outcome. We just don't have enough time. We don't have enough resources, but we don't have enough opportunities like this. And I think that that's one of the things that's really clear in this outbreak, that this has been one of the most destabilizing experiences, if not the most destabilizing experience for many people. But how can we now make a choice to try to turn this very terrible event into something that can catalyze transformative changes that can let us get to where we want to be? Because it's not so often that we see, for example, global governance structures reforming of themselves, right? There's lots of institutional stickiness. Political scientists talk about path dependence. What we need to make sure, though, is how can we take full advantage of any kind of shock to our system, both in the sense of how it reveals some problems that have long-standing been there, but also maybe reveals an opportunity to make some very big differences in how we run our systems. So global governance, for example, I think it's clear from the discussion that our global governance system was not fit for purpose for the kind of challenges that we're increasingly seeing in an interdependent world. We need to make some changes in our global governance system, but that means we also need research that's going to inform what those global governance changes should be. It shouldn't just be based on what we know of from the past. Indeed, the business as usual approaches haven't actually gotten us to where we need to get to. We need new ideas, we need science, we need research about these issues, about global governance, international law, politics, polarization, in order to figure out how do we make changes that will lead to a much better future.
So it seems then that this is a kind of a pivot point. We cannot go back to the old way of doing things. And yet to go forward in a meaningful way, we have to engage in new thinking and new practice. The practice, I think, is in the context of an emergency, practice is extremely important, because it's through practice, through what we actually do, that we learn what works and what doesn't work. And so, Stephen, just to give you another opportunity to really highlight the agenda that you're setting out and the way you're doing it. My understanding is you're seeking to learn in an active way so that research findings are quickly turned around and integrated into current practice. Do you want to just comment on that a little bit?
Well, one thing that's clear in this pandemic is that a lot of countries around the world are experimenting with new systems, some of which are about directly containing the virus. Other times it's about mitigating the socioeconomic impacts that have been caused by the virus or the responses to containing the virus. There's too many natural experiments to not learn from them. That is our imperative at this moment. And it's why we need to be thinking about research and recovery now, even though we're still very much focused on the immediate response to the virus. Because if we don't design our recovery efforts in a way to purposefully learn as much as we can, we'll have missed the learning opportunity. And then everyone's worry should be whether we're just going to reproduce the same practices and systems that haven't actually gotten us to where we want to get to. I mean, we know before the pandemic, from all the reports that come out from the UN and from researchers, policymakers around the world, that we were not on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by their 2030 deadline. So business as usual gets to a disappointing outcome. How can we use this time and the various things that are happening around the world to maximally learn from them on how to do better and not take the status quo route, but actually try to seek transformative change? It's not easy. It requires political will, but it also requires new ideas and new knowledge to get there.
Thank you, Stephen. Iona, in the new report of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, which I haven't read in detail, it was just released this morning, but in the new report, you emphasize very, very clearly and very strongly the relationship between responsible political leadership and citizenship. Can you just try to illuminate that a little bit for us? What does that mean in terms of concrete kind of initiatives or examples?
Well, it implies how political leaders communicate with their citizens. And when I say citizens, it means the people living in that country. They won't always, have that passport, and Christos will relate to that. It implies truth, it implies transparency, it implies explaining things to your population. It implies listening where it's appropriate, because, it means different levels of governance also. Again, if I speak of Germany, we have a very decentralized health system. I think you also in Canada. So our premiers at the Länder level, at the state level, as we call them, become very, very important. Whereas, initially everyone looked to Merkel, for example, and she was one of the leaders, as we experienced from some others around the world, in South Korea, in New Zealand, in Singapore, etc., who did have, a high level of credibility and who communicated with their citizens. But, even that is not enough. If your society already is, let me use a term some colleagues have used, socially infected, because that means if you already have very high levels of inequality, if you have high levels of divisiveness, if you have high levels of racism, etc., with a bit of communication from your leader, you're not going to be able to solve that. And we have found that some leaders have acted more divisive than others and have actually pushed such divisions forward. We've also seen that countries that had very strict austerity measures before the outbreak of the crises, between the financial crises in 2008 and 2009, we've seen that in our southern European countries where they cut back on health systems, etc. But we've also seen it in the UK. And as some people alluded to, this crisis has shown us extreme weaknesses in our societies where we have not acted, or our leaders, depending how governments have changed, have not taken on that notion also of equity, of social protection, and of universal health coverage. And then, of course, there's all the other issues around ecology and education, etc. We could go on forever. But I think in our report, we're really trying to highlight that and also indicate that, yes, some leaders were able to do this better than others because, and this is the last sentence at this stage, because we found that the indicators and the indices we originally had with which we measured preparedness were totally inadequate. Which are the two countries that did best on the Global Health Security Index? The United States and the United Kingdom. And compare that with what has been happening in those countries. So goes back to Stephen, we need that research to show us, what do we actually need to measure? What will tell us how prepared we are or where we are not prepared? And I think just like from Ebola, we learned we need anthropology. I think this time around, we're really noticing we need the social sciences, the political sciences, international relations, and of course, economics.
Thank you. Christos, just to segue from that very point, MSF and many humanitarian organizations learned some very, very important lessons in dealing with the Ebola crisis. around the vital importance of supporting community in terms of contact tracing, in terms of care for people who are sick, in terms of ensuring that the kind of interventions that are available don't actually drive people who are sick underground and away from healthcare services and capacity. Can you just talk about what are some of the lessons and some of the experiences that MSF is having now in terms of COVID and what it's doing now to support community?
Unfortunately, the experience that we get now is exactly the same as we get from every single outbreak. That outbreaks and epidemics by their own very nature are divisive. And you have to position yourself as a humanitarian organization or as a doctor, as a public health expert towards that, and try to see how you overcome all these barriers. We also learned that it is very important to gain trust and acceptance. And again, this is the situation today. In every single context or every single country, I think this is one of the major things. We are confronted this way or another with a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And this is another big barrier that we have. And we have to understand how we gain trust, acceptance, and we co-design the interventions. And of course, it has to do with governance. It has to do with what I said initially about rethinking the public health and resocializing the public health. The medical aspect in this is only one thing. Yes, anthropologists, that's what we learned from Ebola, and I always write, but also now we need sociologists. We need to look at this through several different lenses that we may have missed a lot, especially since the very beginning of this pandemic until very, very recently, unfortunately. And just my last point, because everything goes back to Stephen's very good remark of we are missing this global governance. And maybe later on we will be answering questions by people on what exactly do all leaders have to do at the moment. And it goes back to what you mentioned, Stephen. We need, of course, the data, the evidence to understand what exactly we're missing and what model we have. But the global governance is maybe answer to many of the questions that we will have, as it was also for a humanitarian organization that, of course, is not dealing with this huge magnitude that the global, leaders do.
I think, James, if I may, I think your question and Krista's point about what we've learned from Ebola really gives an opportunity to emphasize Ilona's earlier argument that there's too many countries that didn't bother to try to learn from the experience with Ebola 2014 to 2016. And it's to all of our peril. I think for me, one of the lessons that we did learn from Ebola, but which was not applied really in any country, is remembering that in West Africa, more people actually died from lack of access to maternal, newborn, and child health services because of stoppages related to the Ebola outbreak than who actually died from Ebola itself. And so what that highlights is a couple of things. One is that when responding to a pandemic like COVID-19, we need to, yes, have our eye on the virus, but we also have to have on our eyes on all the other things that make us healthy or not in our society. And so that really emphasizes a need to hone in on the social determinants of health. In that, yes, of course, our health is influenced by the kind of healthcare we can receive, and that's extremely important. But it's even more so, our health is determined by the conditions in which we're born, grow, work, and live our lives. And so it's those kind of broader conditions, which includes healthcare, access to healthcare, which we need to be thinking about in the context of a pandemic and also afterwards. And that was a lesson we have not sufficiently taken from the Ebola outbreak, and we could have.
Thank you, Stephen. I'll just say to the technicians, I am on Slido, and I'm just waiting for something to emerge there in terms of the questions that you may or may not have. All of that said, we've talked about some of the broad issues, and probably I think the major broad issues in terms of how to think about this critical pivot point What are some of the core concepts that we have to think about in terms of how we go forward? One of the core concepts that I would just like us to link our discussion to is this package of ideas around sustainability, around gender equity, and around future resilience. These are really the kind of core sort of thematics, including equity, of course, of the SDGs. Do you want to just comment on that, Iona, and where and how does an emboldened pandemic preparedness initiative, where and how does that fit in that package of ideas?
Well, in a number of ways, and Dr. Tedros has always said that we shouldn't understand health security, or however we call this thing, as something separate, but something that is deeply related to our ecological challenges, that's deeply related to building a sustainable health system that is reliable, that provides equal access, and that is, as I've said earlier, related to social security. And here, you mentioned it when you opened this meeting, the human security concept that has come from Japan, and even the Sendai framework that has come from Japan. They are things that are absolutely critical to this debate and to, creating a new understanding of health security and everything we need to do, that in my mind, also have not received enough attention. And actually, again, if we say, this spotlight actually shows us where the blind spots of our thinking around preparedness have been, and where, in our GPMB report, we use the term pandemic proofing to actually look at various systems and say, how much have you actually thought about that? And, that can be the banking system, the restaurant system, and something that's very, very close to my heart is the World Trade System. I mean, we are now discussing new leadership of the World Trade Organization. Canada will have to decide which candidate to back. And we see now, if we talk global supply chains, if we we heard about the vaccine research earlier, about issues around sharing, about intellectual property, around pricing. So those kind of issues are going to come to the fore in a totally new way. And of course, Médecins Sans Frontières with its Access project is totally on board here and is pushing the agenda. So I think, we've thought preparedness in such a narrow way. And we at the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board have also been self-critical. I mean, we didn't select ourselves, obviously, but we said we need a new composition of this board. This board is not good enough in terms of the preparedness challenges we need to face. And that's, in terms of global governance, is going to be a big challenge also for the International Health Regulations Committee that is meeting right now, that is supposed to look at how these regulations should be revisited, reshaped, rewritten. And, unless we get a new understanding of what some colleagues in political science have called smart sovereignty, we're not going to get anywhere. So it needs a push, and it needs a push from the global health community. There's been this, sort of thing, either you're for UHC or you're for security, picking up too much on the American understanding of health security equals national security. No, that's not it. And I think here we really have to create also a new mindset, and we have to push for this new thinking.
That's a wonderful set of comments, Iona. So it seems then that if we go from the beginning of our discussion to now, this idea of partnership around new ideas coalitions of partners. I don't want to say coalitions of the willing. It's has all kinds of intonations, but a coalition of partners with a orientation towards a shared prosperity. This really does seem, at least from the tone of our discussion, this really does seem to be the way forward. Now, certainly the ideas that we've been talking about, these are not just our ideas. These ideas have resonance in society, many societies around the world, and among civil society organizations, among citizens, among some politicians, some inspired leaders. So in terms of momentum, there's very clearly an opportunity here. That said, we're still in the middle of a major global pandemic. And we still have $11 trillion that have been mobilized by G7 and other OECD countries for their domestic needs, and quite rightly so. I don't chide anyone for looking after your own community and your own people, your own families and your own proximate neighbors. But we also live in a global world of 7.6 billion people. And the funding that has been made available is a pittance for OCHA, for example, 10 billion versus 11 trillion. The funding that the WHO ACT platform is seeking is a pittance, and yet the payoff would be huge. They're looking for $35 billion. Relative to 11 trillion, it's nothing. It's the cost of a cheap lunch in relative terms. So we still come now to this very immediate need for funding. How do you think, Stephen, just because, how do you think this can be approached over the coming week or two at the General Assembly?
Well, it's very clear that we need to be thinking differently about global financing. And I think that it really needs to come from that recognition that we live in an interdependent world where each of our health is interdependent with the health of other people. And if that's true, then it's actually smart of all of us to be advocating for and championing equity around the world and ensuring that everybody is better off, because that's how we're all going to be even better off beyond that. And so I think that too often we think in the worlds in which we see and not the world that we actually live in. I think that the comments from Dr. Bernstein around vaccine nationalism are important in the sense that they really highlight that ideally we all know that the best way of producing and distributing a future COVID-19 vaccine is one that's an equitable way, where the people who need it the most and who are mounting the frontline response, or those who are most vulnerable to this virus, are able to get it when they need it, irrespective of financial arrangements or what country it gets produced in. But that can become really difficult to steer in the absence of a previously existing global framework for how these things should be distributed and produced. I think right now we're playing catch up, and I think it's admirable the work that many people are doing, that United Nations agencies, the World Health Organization are doing in order to try their best to get some equitable distribution of vaccines, for example, and other products. But it really does highlight that we have just a very deep problem with the way we've organized our systems and our global systems, and they're not working. And financing is, of course, maybe the one that we would look to as being the tip of what needs to change, but it is only the tip of the iceberg, in that we need actually not only financing, we need good governance, we need rules, we need laws that we can count on, that countries and other stakeholders will for sure implement so that others can plan accordingly. So in an interdependent world, it's in all of our benefits to see this happen. We're not yet there, but we need to get there.
I would agree, Stephen, that it's the tip of a big iceberg, but it is the tip that is before us in the coming weeks.
That's right.
Do you want to just make a comment there?
Me?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think in some cases it's actually the foundation, because if ever since in the 80s, Ronald Reagan put a zero growth budget on WHO, which led, to a lot of very dire consequences. We have to, if we have an international organization for health, we have to fund it. And there it is really the basis. And I'm very glad to see that the German-French initiative for WHO reform actually starts also from the financing and, says that the regular contributions, we have to pay for that organization, and we have to stop thinking in peanuts. Oh yes, we'll raise it by 3% or something, because you get what you pay for. And in some cases, you really need it as the very basis of work. And then we have to think differently, how should the financing organizations, and remember, we have a number of new ones, we have regional ones, European Development Bank, just to name one. So there are, other sources of finance. Obviously, there is a discussion, I think, this week between the WHO and the G20 finance ministers, for example. But this has got to go broader. We need a new kind of global taxation system. We've talked about that frequently, but we have to address it. We can't keep talking ODA and going back to the same 7 countries. There's, in the end, there's so much each individual country can give. And, there's a private sector out there that has responsibility. And, some of the figures we're talking about, we could get with the blink of an eye if you look at how much Mark Zuckerberg increased in value throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. I think, he could give us those 35 billion just like that. And remember Ted Turner, who actually gave part of his, not that I'm saying, philanthropy is our solution, please don't misunderstand that. But, there have been in the past responsible people such as Ted Turner who said, and the UN Foundation, of course, is one of the things, but he went and he gave what at the time was an incredible amount of money to the United Nations. And if somebody gave that to COVAX, we would be at a new point, and then find new regulatory mechanisms, as Stephen has said, which take a bit more time.
Thank you. I want to thank each of you really for a fulsome discussion. You've really contributed enormously to our understanding of global public health at this critical pivot moment. I also want to thank Dr. Tedros, Director General of the WHO, and our 4 prior speakers, Dr. Philpott, Dr. Bernstein, Dr. Sam Nutt, and Dr. Rajasingham. And of course, again, I want to thank each of you for really a fulsome and thorough discussion. So panelists, I look forward to being in touch. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I'd like once again to thank Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the WHO, for his special address, and also to thank our 4 speakers, Dr. Philpott, Dr. Bernstein, Dr. Nutt, and Dr. Rajasingham, for their presentations. And again, our 3 panelists who have given us a very thorough and fulsome discussion. If you'd like a background brief on the issues that we discussed today, you can go to the Dadala Institute for Global Health Research website, and that's digrh.yorku.ca. As well, tomorrow the summit will continue. We'll be back tomorrow at 9:15 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And tomorrow's themes will be explored thoroughly, and they are shared prosperity, and that is that theme is co-chaired by the Honorable Anne McClellan. And then the second theme that will be explored tomorrow is inclusive societies, and that is chaired by London Mayor Sadiq Khan. If you'd like more information, I urge you to go to the recoveryproject.org website, all one word, for more information and for a full description of the rest of the agenda for the Recovery Summit. See you tomorrow. Thanks very much.